Hi, friends. My name's Trish Roberts, and you're watching The Naked Empire. Tonight, or this morning rather, we have Ben Norton with us, and he's a journalist and writer. His work focused primarily on US foreign policy, the Middle East, media criticism, and movements for economic and social justice. Ben Norton is currently a reporter for Alternet's Grey Zone project. He's also a contributor to the media watchdog Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. And with Max Blumenthal, Ben co-hosts the weekly political podcast, Moderate Rebels. So without further ado, I'll introduce Ben to you.
Thanks
Hi,
so
Ben.
much.
How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm very happy to have you, Ben. So, Ben, let's talk about Yemen, because that's a topic which is least discussed, and it's really ignored mostly by the mainstream media. And I just wanted to, there's a terrible humanitarian crisis happening there and with little attention. And I was just wondering if you could maybe just explain the sort of the bigger picture of how this occurred. I know that's a big question, but if you could do that, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's important to understand that this is a humanitarian crisis that has been created by a war, by violent conflict, and by a blockade ultimately as well. And unfortunately, many humanitarian groups often have to have some kind of pretense of neutrality. And what that means is they don't really discuss who's to blame. But the United Nations, when it talks about the conflict in Yemen, to its credit, it repeatedly stresses that this is, quote, a man-made crisis. And what's not mentioned, the subtext of that, is that it's a man-made crisis created by the US and Saudi Arabia. Also the UK and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, but the primary two actors in the war in Yemen are the US and Saudi Arabia. So for some context here, since March 26, 2015, for about 28 months now, Saudi Arabia has been brutally bombing Yemen. According to the head of its air campaign, the Saudi coalition, which is led by Saudi Arabia, but backed by the US, the UK, the UAE, and several other countries, has been bombing Yemen, and the head of its coalition says that they've launched 90,000 air sorties. I mean, this is 28 months of nearly constant bombing. There have only been a few periodic breaks within that. And of course, much of this bombing has targeted civilian infrastructure. Now, why are they doing this? There's not much discussion of why exactly it's happening. And when there is discussion, it's very misleading. So one of the most common talking points that we hear in corporate media outlets, which is very distorted, and I would argue simply false, is that this is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That's not true. It's simply false. Iran's influence inside Yemen is very minimal. Saudi Arabia's influence inside Yemen is very strong, and Saudi Arabia is trying to restore a government in the south of the country led by the former president Hadi, Abd Rabu Mansour Hadi. And Hadi is a president who technically he won an election in 2012, but this was an election with no other candidates. This is an election in which he overstayed his term in office illegally. And then when the Houthi movement, which I'll get to in a moment, which is a rebel movement inside Yemen, took over the capital in late 2014, Hadi then fled to Saudi Arabia for protection. So he's a Saudi puppet, and he's backed by the US, of course. Well, Saudi Arabia has been trying to restore Hadi to power. But what's actually happening is the majority of the population, about 80% of the population, lives under the control of another government, which has been created by a rebel movement known as Ansar Allah, or also just known as the Houthis. And the Houthis, it's hard to find a comparison. They're very unique. Some people compare them to Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance movement. And I think that is a somewhat fair comparison. So for instance, the Houthi movement actually has close ties to Hezbollah politically. There's even been some reports that Hezbollah has helped train Houthi fighters fighting Saudi Arabia. But anyway, we could get into the nitty-gritty details, but what's more important is understanding the basic details. The basic details is the Houthi movement has widespread support inside Yemen and has created a government in the north that governs 80% of the population. So they are essentially the government of Yemen. but they're not the internationally recognized government. And the US and Saudi Arabia have spent 2 years trying to restore the puppet government in the South that is going to be compliant to Western demands, that is going to allow Western oil corporations and companies to send trade off of the southwest border. The southwest of Yemen is very strategically important near the Red Sea there, and there's something called the Mandab Strait, or the Bab al-Mandab, where every single day 3 to 4 million barrels of oil travels through, along with important ships for trade of other goods. So this is a very strategically important region. Yemen does not really have natural resources like Saudi Arabia does. It doesn't have large oil reserves, but it's a strategically located country in the region. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia and the US are trying to do whatever they can to prevent another country in the region from emerging that exercises any kind of independent foreign policy, as Syria did, as Libya did, and that especially has some kind of close relations with Iran. So again, I know that's a lot of context there, and it's a lot to wrap your head around, but the point is that despite media outlets constantly calling this a proxy war, for instance, Vox here in the US expressly said recently in a video, they said Yemen is a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. That is blatantly false. I mean, that is propaganda that has been spread by the US and Saudi Arabia, because of course the US accuses anyone who it wants to overthrow of being a tool of Iran, a supporter of Hezbollah, etc. That helps them justify military aggression. And of course, this war has left thousands and thousands of civilians dead, and has left millions on the verge of famine. And inside Yemen now, thanks to this war, we have the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, the largest in the world. And again, when we're talking about media coverage, we frequently hear about Syria, which is important because Syria is also a horrific crisis, although the media reporting on that is even worse. But when we hear about Syria all the time, of course, that is usually in media reports, those reflect the atrocities committed by U.S. enemies, by Western enemies, namely the Syrian government, Iran, Russia. What we don't hear about, of course, is the atrocities committed by the U.S., by its proxies, by Saudi Arabia. Well, this is also somewhat true for the conflict in Yemen. And there has been very inadequate reporting on this conflict where it's very clear, there is no question, the U.S.-Saudi coalition is responsible for the majority of the civilian casualties. They've killed thousands of civilians in the bombing campaign, and especially thanks to disease and hunger. And Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East, being bombed by one of the richest, Saudi Arabia, which is the largest oil exporter in the world. And now Yemen has been suffering from the worst cholera outbreak in history, in recorded history. So records for cholera began in 1949. Since 1949, there has been no worse cholera outbreak than the one in Yemen. And cholera has been eradicated in the West. This is not a disease that's a problem here in the US or in Australia or in the UK, in Europe. But in Yemen, where the disease had nearly been eradicated before the conflict, there now have been nearly 500,000 cases since late April, about 450,000 cases. And they're still growing. And this is actually worse than Haiti in 2011, after the horrific earthquake there. There was an outbreak of cholera. So we're talking catastrophic levels. In 3 months, Yemen has had more cholera cases than Haiti had in the entire year of 2011. At least 2,000 people have died. And that is, of course, in addition to all the children who have died from preventable diseases, from hunger, and from other causes. UNICEF estimated, I'll just add one more thing here, sorry. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but just so people understand, UNICEF estimated that in 2016 alone, 63,000 children died in Yemen from preventable causes thanks to this war. 63,000 children. And again, we hear nothing, we hear no media reports. We hear constantly of Syria, where unfortunately hundreds of thousands of people have died. It's horrific. But then we hear nothing about Yemen, where the U.S. is directly responsible for fueling a war that last year alone led to the deaths of 63,000 children because of preventable causes.
Yeah, isn't it? That's just like amazing, isn't it? But and the media to be the mainstream media to be so on page with the establishment that they just know what not to talk about and what I mean. It's truly amazing. And the wasn't it the UN? They decided not to supply the cholera vaccine. Is that right?
Yeah.
They said, and they. If you could talk a little bit about that. Oh,
Yeah, I
and
mean, this
whatever
is
else
something.
you want to talk about in that.
This is something that the UN certainly should be. I like this comment here. Capitalists have lost their morals. That's certainly true. I would say they never really had morals, but that's not. The system doesn't allow that. But the World Health Organization, they deserve criticism for this. However, it should be put in a larger context. The World Health Organization announced a few weeks ago that they're ending their cholera vaccination campaign inside Yemen for two reasons. One, because they simply could not access much of the country due to the war. And I mentioned, I did an overview of the war, but what's even less mentioned is that the U.S. Navy is helping Saudi Arabia enforce a crippling blockade on Yemen, which is similar in many ways to the blockade being imposed on Gaza for 10 years now. Well, there's been a crippling blockade on Yemen that has prevented food, humanitarian supplies, water, fuel from entering the country. And this is a country where 90% of the food before the conflict had been imported, so not only has the war fueled hunger, which again, like I said, has led to mass death and pushed millions of Yemenis onto the brink of famine. But not only that, the blockade has really prevented food from coming in and exacerbated the hunger. And human rights organizations have expressly said that hunger is being used as a weapon in Yemen. But in addition to that, the World Health Organization announced that it's going to be ending its vaccination campaign because they simply can't get access to many of the parts of Yemen that are afflicted by cholera because they're being bombed and attacked by the U.S.-Saudi coalition because there's fighting going on between the Houthis and the Saudi coalition. Also, another factor that's related to it is they simply don't have funding. Repeatedly, the UN has tried to raise money to support Yemen, and repeatedly, they don't even get more than 1/4 of the requested funding. There are a variety of reasons for that. There are other conflicts going on, the war in Syria. Yemen is simply not on the radar, even though, again, as I stress, this is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world that has been created by a US-backed, a UK-backed war. It's even worse in Syria, but it doesn't get any attention. It doesn't get the funding it needs. And also, the US, under Trump, is boasting of how it's cutting funding for international aid institutions in the United Nations. In fact, Nikki Haley, who is the ultra-right-wing US ambassador to the UN, she boasted that the U.S. was cutting millions of dollars in funding. She literally bragged about it. So the World Health Organization ended its program, and they said that we're going to spend the little money we have trying to fight hunger in Yemen, and not hunger and cholera, because they said cholera is basically, at this point, they can treat it, but they can't really prevent it anymore.
Oh, really? God.
Yeah, it's hell on earth.
Yeah, because that's just going to rip through the population, and I don't know. Could you call this an intentional ethnic cleansing by Saudi Arabia? Like, would you sort of, or is that too extreme?
Well, ethnic cleansing is a very specific meaning. I wouldn't necessarily say it's ethnic cleansing because that's what, like, for instance, the Israeli government has done inside Palestine, where you are displacing one ethnic population, namely the Palestinians, and replacing them with Israeli settlers. That is ethnic cleansing. In Yemen, it's different. It's not like Saudi settlers are trying to take over the country. I think you could argue that it's borderline genocidal. It's borderline genocidal, in the sense that, Saudi Arabia isn't necessarily trying to kill every single Yemeni, but they're using genocidal tactics, namely starvation, mass starvation, in order to force the population to essentially concede to whatever puppet government is being imposed on them. And again, they're
Yes.
using hunger as a weapon, and they're
Yeah.
relentlessly bombing civilian infrastructure. And again, they're doing this with staunch American and British support.
Yeah.
The coalition, in media reports, they commonly use the phrase Saudi-led coalition. And that is true. The coalition is Saudi-led. However, although the bombers are themselves Saudi, the planes they're flying are not Saudi. The planes they're flying are American and British. The fuel in the planes is American and British. The weapons they're using are American and British, including cluster bombs, which are banned by more than 100 countries. US and UK made cluster bombs have been dropped on civilian areas inside Yemen. They're also using military assistance from the American and British militaries who have physically been in the command room with the Saudi military. So this is, again, I use the phrase US like hyphen or US/Saudi war because this is not, it is technically Saudi led on paper, but without American and British support, this conflict would never be able to go on. The war would be over, which is also true for
Yeah.
other wars like the war in Syria. But the only reason Saudi Arabia is allowed to continue bombing Yemen politically, militarily, economically is because of its support from Western countries. And that's why, I mean, not just Americans, but especially Americans, that's why we are directly complicit. Our tax dollars are going to fund the mass killing through actual war, but also through starvation, also through the spread of diseases of Yemenis. And this is blood on our hands.
How do you you do some research? You talk about mainstream media issues, and I just wondered how do they manage the establishment and the mainstream media? How do they manage to sort of communicate where the mainstream media don't know what not to promote? Not to talk about, like Yemen. I often wonder, do they send one another memos, or how do they know what not to talk about? Because they seem to be so on page with one another. You know what I mean? That you just don't hear about Yemen hardly at all. And I just think, how do they? You know what I'm saying? Or is that a strange?
First of all, I think we should make sure we understand. It's not some concerted conspiracy where people are meeting together and talking about what they're going to ignore. It's much, I would say, simpler, but also more insidious than that. And again, I mean, I joked earlier, someone had commented about how capitalists have no morals. It's systemic. And that's the point I really want to stress with the media. The media is an industry. It is a for-profit industry. This is not a non-profit institution that exists to serve the people. This is a for-profit company or industry rather that exists to make money. That's the goal. Every media outlet, almost every single one, their goal is not to provide news to the public. Their goal is not to inform people what's going on in the world, to be better citizens, etc. Their goal is to make money, and everything else is at the end of the day, going to revolve around that goal. So when it comes to issues that people cover, what people don't understand is one of the reasons that corporate media outlets are so obsessed with issues like Russiagate and Russia and Putin. It's not simply because the Democratic Party here in the US is using this as a convenient political scapegoat for losing to Donald Trump, a far-right billionaire bigot. It's not just because it helps justify U.S. military buildup, the military-industrial complex. It's also because it gets great ratings. I mean, these kinds of stories get people to tune in. They watch it. They listen to it. They read about it. Yemen is not sexy. Yemen is not popular. No one even knows where Yemen is. They don't know what it is. They don't know the history of it. And a lot of people have a mistaken view. They simply say, oh, well, people have been killing each other in that region forever. No, it's not true. Yemen has actually seen very few wars. This violence inside the country is relatively new. And, it's similar to what we hear about Israel-Palestine. People are always like, well, they've been fighting for 1,000 years. No, Israel was created in 1948. This is a very new conflict, and it's a conflict in which we ourselves are directly involved. Our government is funding all of these conflicts. So that's certainly part of it. It's ratings, it's money, it's advertising revenue. And then there's also the element of what the U.S. government essentially wants. And the irony of this, I mean, you mentioned I write a lot for a media watchdog here in the U.S. called Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR. And one of the things I write a lot about is how media outlets, for the most part, serve as a kind of mouthpiece for the government. And this is not true simply of the US, of course. This is true of many countries. It's true to an extent of the Australian media. It's true of the British media, but especially in the US. Noam Chomsky, many listeners probably know him, the renowned scholar, dissident, and media critic. He has a very famous book called Manufacturing Consent, in which he does a detailed political and economic analysis of the mass media. He looks at, the political ties, but he also looks at the economic ties. He looks at corporations, what they're invested in. So as an example, here's one of countless examples. The Washington Post, probably the second most important newspaper in the US after the New York Times, is owned by the richest man in the world, Jeff Bezos, who's the head of Amazon. He recently took over Bill Gates as being the richest man on the planet. He is so wealthy, more than $80 billion. I mean, approaching $100 billion. It's unfathomable the levels of wealth these plutocrats have. He owns the Washington Post, and he also owns Amazon. And Amazon just happens to have a very large multi-million-dollar deal with the CIA. So, I mean, again, you can look at those kinds of ties, but in general, that's not unique. Those kinds of ties exist throughout the industry. You look at CNN. CNN keeps hiring people like Michael Hayden. Michael Hayden is the former director of the CIA and the NSA. He was director of both of them, the CIA and the NSA. It's already enough to be director of one. They're both horrible enough institutions. And Michael Hayden was recently hired by CNN as a regular commentator. These are literal government officials who are being hired by supposed independent media outlets to tell us supposed news. I mean, they don't even have any pretense of independence anymore. They also hired James Clapper. Clapper is a perjurer. He lied under oath to Congress. He was intelligence official who lied about NSA spying. He is now also being hired by CNN as a regular commentator. So
they're tragic, aren't they? It's tragic.
I mean, it's not surprising that conflicts like the war in Yemen have been ignored. I mean, this is also not new historically. A lot of people don't even know what the Iran-Iraq War was. Not that long ago, in the 1980s, after the 1979 revolution in Iran, in which Iranians overthrew a US-backed dictator, the Shah, who had previously been only installed because in 1953, the US, the CIA, and MI6 from the UK, they overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran, of Mohammad Mossadegh, in order to control oil resources inside Iran, which is very large oil reserves. Well, anyway, in 1979, after the Iranian Revolution, the US backed Saddam Hussein when he invaded Iran. And from 1980 to 1988, Iran and Iraq fought one of the most brutal wars in the 20th century. It was compared by many commentators to World War I. The Iran-Iraq War was so brutal that 1 million people died. There was trench warfare. There was chemical weapons use. I mean, Saddam Hussein used gas on Iranian civilians and military fighters that was provided by the U.S. There was almost no media coverage. It was referred to as the Forgotten War or the Invisible War here in the U.S. And still today, people really don't know anything about that conflict, and they don't know that there's a reason Iran is very hesitant about U.S. influence. There's a reason Iran has every single right to be resistant to U.S. imperial machinations in the region, because that war was within our lifetimes. This is not that long ago, but that got no attention either. And then, of course, there are other conflicts. Israel-Palestine gets some attention, but when certain things happen, when Palestinians are killed, it gets little attention. So Yemen is not unique, but Yemen happens to be the worst crisis in the world, and it simply gets very little attention.
Yeah, it's truly tragic, and it's kind of frightening. You can't, I actually contacted a representative, a political representative here, a senator, about Yemen, and her response basically was, we will monitor the situation. I mean, monitor. what on earth is that? I said, what does that mean? Monitor? You're going to monitor a genocide? I said to her. She hasn't gotten back to me, but I said, I said, I've asked her about the U.S. I've basically said, I mean, the U.S. is basically trying to start wars with Russia and China and all the other sort of meddling that it's doing, Venezuela and all of that. And I said, why are we, following along? Why is the Australian government just following along? And she didn't really have an answer. She just sort of said, we've been allies with the US. It wasn't even an answer, basically. The Australian government has no, no spine, no moral spine, really. And it's kind of, I just find it disgusting, particularly this situation with Yemen. They've been really silent, completely silent. It's just appalling. I just wanted to ask you about, it looks like Qatar, which is such a small country. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about Yemen?
Oh, no, I mean, there's so many things we could talk about.
There's so much to say. Well, please, because it gets so little. So if there's anything at all you want to talk about Yemen, please feel free to, we could make this all about Yemen. Because I know that it just doesn't get any.
We should definitely talk about Qatar. We should talk about Syria, Palestine. No, I think it's good to talk about other issues. I'll end the Yemen discussion with this, and I'll say, it's really important to understand and to stress that this is not a Saudi war. When we hear American politicians, British politicians, others discuss this, they commonly talk about it as if it's a Saudi problem. And they blame Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who's been overseeing the war. It's not a Saudi war. Saudi Arabia is, of course, playing a leadership role, but this is fundamentally a war being waged by the US, the UK, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. All four of those countries are directly involved. And if it were not for American and British support, it could not be waged. Period. End of story. Even the New York Times editorial board acknowledged that. Without US support, the coalition would be grounded overnight. So that's why it's so important for activists, for peace advocates, for journalists to speak out about what their governments are doing, because it's very similar to Israeli wars in Gaza. As soon in 2014, when for 51 days Israel bombarded Gaza, the U.S. supported them right until the end. And then finally, when it became so clear that it was no longer deniable that Israel was intentionally targeting civilian infrastructure, bombing UN shelters, bombing schools, hospitals inside Gaza, eventually, finally, President Obama, after supporting Israel for 51 days, he said, all right, that's enough. You need to stop this, Israel. And overnight, Israel stopped. Overnight. The same thing could happen for Saudi Arabia. If the U.S. said that it's withdrawing all support for the war in Yemen, the war would end immediately. And I'm not exaggerating, literally immediately. But of course, the Trump administration is doing the opposite. Trump is ramping up the war on terror, and he is ramping up the war in Yemen in particular. So unfortunately, this war isn't going to end anytime soon.
Haven't they actually put sort of the U.S. military, like there's actually, that saying boots on the ground? Have they actually put in troops now? I know that Trump actually did that completely blundered sort of attack on that village in the beginning when he first came in to just show how, just sort of as a show of strength kind of thing. And that was killed a bunch of civilians there, including that young girl, that Anwar al-Awlaki's daughter. But I just wanted to, I just sort of was thinking actually also that, the U.S. Agency for International Development, I sort of read in The Intercept that they actually, as well as talking about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, they also approved the weapons sales apparently for the Saudis. So they're actually selling weapons to the Saudis while sort of reporting to Congress that there's a terrible humanitarian crisis. I mean, talk about a conflict, it's just ridiculous.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're talking about some of the largest arms sales in history. The Obama administration in its 8 years did $112 billion of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration has tried to meet that, and Trump visited Saudi Arabia 2 months ago, and he pledged to sell $110 billion of arms with a B, $110 billion in arms to Saudi Arabia.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and it looks like that might actually go through. I mean, the Saudi economy is actually in a very precarious situation right now because there is very little in terms of economic diversity. It's an entirely oil-run economy. The price of oil has fallen largely because of Saudi overproduction of oil. And this is actually an issue that is really related to Venezuela, which we might talk about later. What people don't
yes.
understand is that one of the reasons Venezuela is going through so many economic problems right now, and it is because the
Mm,
price of oil has plummeted since 2014. And
mm,
that is simply because of Saudi overproduction. I mean, the
mm,
U.S. pressured Saudi Arabia to continue pumping more and more and more oil and exporting it. And by
mm,
flooding the global market with oil, it dropped
mm,
the overall oil price on the global market.
mm,
And
mm,
oil economies, namely Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, were hit very hard. At
mm,
the same
mm.
time, Saudi Arabia has so much oil and it exports so much that it hasn't hurt the economy too much, but it's
Mm.
beginning to feel that. And
Right.
the fact that they spent $112 billion in arms deals, that's a lot of money.
Yes.
So it's absolutely important to stress that, as I said earlier, the Saudi coalition in Yemen is using U.S. weapons, U.S. planes, U.S. military
Mm,
intelligence, U.S. fuel.
mm,
I
mm,
mean, it's kind of an outsourcing of war.
mm,
Obama,
mm,
he was a smart imperialist. Trump is
mm,
a more blatant imperialist. So, I mean, Trump basically just threatened the genocidal nuclear extermination of North Korea. He said,
yes.
he said fire and fury like the world has never seen. Obama
Mm,
was much more articulate. He didn't use so much blustery biblical rhetoric, but he
mm,
did very similar things. Um,
mm,
and an example of that is, of course, the war in Yemen, also the war in Syria and elsewhere, the war in Libya. But
mm,
Obama essentially outsourced U.S. wars. And this is
mm,
a very smart tactic because, one, it means Americans don't die. So there's
mm,
even less media attention than normal, like the wars in
yeah.
Iraq. It
Mm,
also means that that you can blame other countries for the atrocities that you are backing.
yes.
So when the U.S. does admit that Saudi Arabia commits war crimes in Yemen, and for instance, in October, the Saudi-U.S. coalition bombed a funeral in the capital of Yemen, Sana'a, and killed 140 people and wounded 400, at least 400, the majority civilians. I mean, this is an attack
Mm,
on a funeral house. And
yes.
the U.S. did kind of slap Saudi Arabia on the wrist and criticize them. But again,
Mm,
by outsourcing the war to another country, even though you're paying for it, even though you're giving them all the weapons and you literally have military advisors advising them, you can
mm,
blame them. You don't have to blame yourself. And then what's
yeah.
even most outrageous is we now know because of internal leaks that the U.S. State Department, their legal department, the lawyers in the State Department, have been
Mm,
plotting ways to prevent international legal action against the U.S. They've been plotting, ways using the law to absolve the U.S. of complicity for the Saudi war crimes committed in Yemen.
oh, really?
So not only
Wow.
are they fueling it and helping Saudi Arabia carry out these crimes,
Mm,
they're trying to
mm,
ensure that they cannot be held accountable in any way.
yeah, it's
And that
amazing.
was under
It's,
Obama, not just Trump.
oh, yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, what was it, 3 bombs every hour of every day for 8 years. That was Obama's administration. Just frightening.
Yeah,
Um,
Nobel Peace Prize winner.
yeah, really. um,
Just like Henry
so,
Kissinger.
yeah, yeah. You know, the Middle Eastern Institute, I read that they gave $20 million to Congress, I think, and they, do you know much about them? Did I get that right? The Middle Eastern
Uh,
Institute?
a little different.
A
It's
little
kind of the
different.
other way around. So the
Oh,
Middle
the
East
other
Institute is a leading
institute.
think tank here in the U.S. It has a
Mm,
lot of influence inside Washington, D.C. They
mm.
got $20 million from the United Arab Emirates, which is a
Oh, that's good.
dictatorship. This is an
Mm,
absolute monarchy. It's not even a
mm,
constitutional monarchy. It's an absolute monarchy. And
mm,
the
mm,
UAE, although of course it's a very close ally of the West,
mm,
the UAE gave $20 million in 2 years, in 2016
mm,
and 2017, $20 million to the Middle East Institute, which is a very
mm,
influential think tank. The
mm,
Middle East Institute also gets funding from Qatar, from the U.S. government, from large oil companies and large corporations.
mm,
it employs people like Charles Lister. He's one of the many employees. Charles Lister is a notorious war hawk here in the U.S. He's cited in every single media report on Syria. You read the New York Times, read the Washington Post. Oftentimes, the first person they ever cite is Charles Lister. Charles Lister has lobbied for years for the U.S. to overthrow violently the government in Syria. He previously worked for the Brookings Doha Institution, which was in Qatar and funded by Qatar. He, never fails to toe the line. He says what Gulf regimes, like to be heard, and he is constantly calling for the U.S. to provide more support to the rebels in Syria. Blah 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 blah. Well, he is a prominent member of this think tank, which is completely bankrolled by Gulf regimes, and it's not the only think tank. The Middle East Institute is very influential, but the Atlantic Council. It's important to understand, and actually, I think there needs to be more reporting on this. I try to do some reporting. The Intercept does some reporting, but it doesn't get much attention. Think tanks are not independent. This isn't as big in other countries, but especially in the U.S. It's true in the U.K. with Chatham House and other organizations, but in the U.S., the government has, in the age of neoliberalism, has outsourced many of its former duties to think tanks that are funded by the government. So the term NGO, non-governmental organization, is actually very misleading because a lot of NGOs are funded by governments. But what they can do is they can say they're independent and they can say they're not puppets. And this is very common in media reporting. At FAIR, the media watchdog, I write about this sometimes. Also, a colleague of mine, Adam Johnson, does a lot of really great reporting on this. And he shows how, for instance, media reports on North Korea, they commonly cite think tanks and NGOs that are funded by Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman. They're funded by weapons companies that profit off of the sale of weapons to South Korea. So, for instance, there's a lot of discussion recently of the THAAD system, a missile system, and the companies that fund that technology fund think tanks whose experts are quoted in media outlets saying that South Korea should buy more THAAD systems. It's money laundering. They're using media reports as advertising, basically, and that's true for governments too.
Yeah, I heard that the Raytheon, I think, has gotten all these orders for not only more THAAD systems. I think they're going to produce 40 to, I don't know, there's a huge, like 100 or something THAAD systems. They've got this, and also they've gotten heaps of orders for those F-35s or something, that special. But yeah, obviously the THAAD systems. Do they even? The thing is, do they even really work? I know that they can actually launch, I think, as well, nuclear missiles, as well as supposedly fend off, but I sort of wonder if they even work. But do you know much?
THAADs can't launch nuclear missiles. They're supposedly defensive, right? But that's what everyone says about any kind of military conflict. No one says, I'm going to launch an offensive war. Every single person in history has always said, no, I'm waging a war of defense. We're defending ourselves. They're the aggressor. And at the end of the day, one side is the aggressor and one side is the defender in most conflicts. There are conflicts in which both sides are equally bad, but like World War I, which was just the stupidest war in history.
Really.
But at the same time, I don't really know. I'm not an expert on THAAD systems. I don't really. I've been following the conflicts in the Korean Peninsula pretty closely, but I'll say this: military companies, contractors, defense contractors, arms, the arms corporations, they frequently are kind of soothsayers, con artists. Another example of this is, and actually, Israel-Palestine. There have been some reports by an MIT scientist, Theodore Postel, that some of the technology used by what's called the Iron Wall by Israel, that is it's supposedly a system that can shoot down missiles and rockets that are being sent from Gaza into Israel, into besieged, blockaded Gaza. Supposedly, Theodore Postel, the MIT scientist, he says that actually doesn't work. And actually, there are other scientists who have said the same, who have said that the Iron Dome, I said the Iron Wall, the Iron Dome, Iron Wall is something very different in Israeli politics. The Iron Dome system might actually just be a kind of PR scheme that the Israeli government can use to say, oh, well, we're defending our citizens, blah, blah, blah. And also, I personally think this is an example of how this technology is used to exacerbate and hyperbolize the threats Israel does not face any threats from Palestinians. It's Palestinians who face extermination. They're the ones who are being blockaded. They're the ones who are being killed. They're the ones who are being starved by Israel. And Gaza, for a decade, has been under a blockade that the UN has said that UN experts have said is illegal. But anyway, so every few months or weeks when a stray rocket goes into Israel, that almost never hits populated areas. It almost never destroys anything. Maybe at most it does some damage. But Israel can say, oh, well, they're shooting rockets at us. And if it were not for this system, this $1 million system that we bought, the Iron Dome, then we would have civilian casualties. No, I think these things, they go hand in glove, right? Like there are military contractors, and it's in their vested interest to exaggerate the influence of missile defense systems they send to countries. And of course, they make tons of money. The governments of those countries can pretend that they're protecting their citizens, and they both benefit.
Can I ask you about like North Korea? Do you think that is part of this, drumming up and alarmist stuff to do with selling weapons? Like suddenly everybody's buying a lot more weapons from Raytheon and stuff like that. So it's sort of like it creates this raised alert, and then different countries start buying more weapons. But also, do you think that this might have anything to do with that the US may actually, drop a nuclear bomb on North Korea, and possibly that's got some strategic thing about then sort of somehow getting a strategic position to attack eventually China and Russia? Do you know what I mean? Like sort of basically, sometimes I wonder about that, but I don't know. What do you think about the whole North Korea thing?
Well, I'll say there's no question whatsoever that the U.S. is the aggressor. North Korea is not the aggressor. What countries has North Korea invaded? What countries has North Korea bombed? And what's important to also understand for context, I recently wrote an article this week in Alternet with Max Blumenthal about, first of all, the incredibly misleading media reporting on this, but also the context historically, politically, for North Korea. What is never mentioned, especially in the US, is from 1950 to 1953, in the Korean War, which is known in the US as the Forgotten War. It's literally referred to as that. In the Korean War, the US government, by its own admission, killed 20% of North Korea's population. This was a genocidal war. The U.S., by its own admission, killed 1/5 of all North Koreans. The U.S. destroyed basically every single city, just turned them to rubble inside North Korea. The U.S. used napalm, like the U.S. dropped, bomb after bomb. The U.S. in fact bombed Korea more than it bombed Japan in all of World War II. And again, this is a war we almost never hear about. And North Koreans have not forgotten. They've not forgotten that, according to the U.S. government, 3 million of them were killed, half of whom were civilians. And today there are 25 million North Koreans, and the way that they're discussed, they're so dehumanized that we don't even hear about the human beings who live in this country. All we hear about is Kim Jong, whatever this week, the supposed lie that Kim Jong-un did. And we hear all these, and related to our article, Max Blumenthal's and I article on Alternet, we also talked about the blatant lies we hear in the media. So for instance, literal lies. Like you can make up anything about North Korea and it'll be published. So a media report recently was that Kim Jong-un's uncle was killed that Kim Jong-un fed him to dogs. This was a blatant
Yeah.
lie. There is
Yeah.
nothing true
Right.
about it at all. It's just made up.
No.
It's made up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was reported by every media outlet. And then I mean, they're just so outrageous. I mean, it's like
Yeah. Yeah.
satire. Media
I know.
reports, there have been media reports in the US that North Korea claimed that it discovered unicorns. That was totally false.
Jesus.
It was
Oh no.
it was a lie. Or that all North Koreans, maybe
No.
you heard this in Australia, because actually there were some two young Australian men who made a film about this. There were media reports supposedly that North Koreans were being forced to have the same haircut. A total lie. That is totally false. And actually, there was a very interesting film made by two young Australians who went to North Korea and got a haircut, and they filmed it.
No, really.
But so anyway, all right, look,
Yeah.
we don't really know much about North Korea. It is a it is a police state. They very tightly control everything that goes in and goes out. There's no independent media inside the country, and that's why we need to be very, very skeptical of any report, especially these outlandish, just made up reports.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, do I think the U.S. is going to nuke North Korea? Well, sure. I sure do. I sure hope not. I really, really hope not. Someone commented, I heard that about the haircut. Yeah, I mean, it was totally false. It was a blatant lie. I really hope not. But that said, to be frank, I actually don't think there's going to be a nuclear war. I think the U.S. is escalating a lot of these threats because, one, like you mentioned, war is very profitable. And of course, Lockheed Martin is actually seeing more and more weapon interest. In fact, Reuters published a story this week about this, about how Lockheed Martin is seeing all this new business thanks to the escalating aggression in the Korean Peninsula. And also because war it serves a lot of great domestic reasons, right? I mean, there's this kind of infamous adage that you don't fight wars for what's going on outside your country, you fight them for what's going on inside. I don't think that's entirely true, but there's an element of truth in the sense that Trump is incredibly unpopular. Every time he bombs a foreign country, he's praised by both Republicans and Democrats. So when he bombed,
isn't that frightening? They just go wild, don't they? It's like when he dropped all those bombs on that Syrian airport. And then they were all, oh yay, he's become presidential. I mean, oh God,
And then Brian Williams, a famous news presenter here, Brian Williams, he sexualized it. He said, "Oh, those missiles are so beautiful." And then he said, "I'm reminded of the great Stephen Cohen, who said in one of his lyrics, he said something like, I'm reminded by the beauty of their weapons." It was this very strange. I mean, so anytime
the singer, what's his name? Cohen, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I know. Just put Leonard Cohen, and he would be appalled if he was alive to hear that. It's just it's frightening. It's really frightening. Sometimes it almost seems like watching a really bizarre movie, like the media and the government. It's almost like it's gone to this point where it's you can hardly believe. I can hardly believe what you see, what the media says and what the government says. I don't know. It's frightening. But you know what? A lot of people too don't realize that Obama was actually they used to do those military training things, and he dropped dummy bombs on the borders, I think, of North Korea, and they're doing sort of these threatening exercises all the time, and have been doing that for on and off for quite some time. And of course, North Korea, it makes them of course they're going to be frightened, and they're never going to give up nuclear weapons while that's going on. I mean, they've seen what happened to Libya. Any country that gives up their weapons is in trouble, basically. So it's
I'm really glad you Libya, because that's often forgotten.
Oh God, yes,
Gaddafi agreed to end his nuclear weapons production program, and in 2011, his government was violently overthrown by NATO and in coalition with Al-Qaeda-linked extremist groups, namely the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. And this is actually something that is such an enormous scandal. We haven't even gotten to the beginning of it. There's been constant, obsession here in the U.S. over Benghazi and the attack on the U.S. consulate there. The Republicans use that, again and again as a bludgeon. That is not even scratching the surface. Like
Mm-hmm.
the Republican obsession with Benghazi is ironic because it's ignoring the much larger scandal, and it's also ironic because the reason they're doing that is not a coincidence. It's because Republicans supported overthrowing Gaddafi, just like Democrats. War in the U.S., but in much of the world, is a bipartisan endeavor. I mean, this is true for Australia and other countries. Both of the major parties agree on these things. For instance, John McCain, who is a seasoned veteran war criminal. I mean, this is a man who has never seen a war he didn't like, who has pushed for the U.S. to invade and destroy every single country. McCain recently was diagnosed with brain cancer. And Democrats did a standing ovation for him in Congress. A standing ovation. This is a war criminal. But again, they don't care about Iraqis at the end of the day. They don't care about Syrians or Yemenis or Palestinians or Koreans. And it's very clear when we look at this as well. I mean, there simply is little difference between the two parties, and that's why Obama. I mean, personally, I doubt Obama himself was overseeing a lot of this stuff. It's just that's how the U.S. government operates. The U.S. government is an enormous institution. The U.S. military continues its wars throughout different administrations. And North Korea has been a target. North Korea is one of the last remaining countries in the world that has not been reincorporated into the U.S.-led imperial order, that does not, allow Western corporations access to its markets. And just like Libya was overthrown in 2011, just like Syria was on the verge of being overthrown, but Russia and Iran assisted the Syrian government, and that was one of the few governments that was not overthrown. But if you look at North Korea's statements, they actually quote they cite what happened in Libya as an example. They cite Gaddafi. Gaddafi was brutally murdered in the street. He was sodomized with a bayonet by extremist U.S.-backed rebels. And then let's look at what Libya is like now. Libya today is a total failed state. There is no central government. There are competing governments. And in the eastern part of the country, a CIA-trained warlord, Khalifa Haftar, who lived in rural Virginia, suburban Virginia for 20 years, near Langley, the headquarters of the CIA. I wonder what he was doing there. He now controls the eastern part of Libya. Women have been banned from traveling on their own in eastern Libya, like in Saudi Arabia. There are open slave markets where sub-Saharan African refugees are being sold openly out in the public in NATO-liberated Libya. ISIS created a caliphate in Sirte. I mean, it's so the scandal that this should be, that NATO destroyed a rich North African country, which also happened to have very large oil reserves, which are now, the oil is pumping. Western oil companies are getting access to that oil, but the population is living in complete crisis. Thousands of people have been killed. 1/3 of the population fled into Tunisia. I mean, it is just so crazy. And that was something that was overseen by the Democratic administration, by Barack Obama. And Trump, of course, now that he's in office, the U.S. is looking for the next countries it can destroy. Libya was destroyed, and North Korea is next on the list, also Venezuela. And fortunately, I don't think people are not going to allow a nuclear war to happen. Also, South Korea is furious. South Korea does not, because the U.S. is not going to, North Korea cannot bomb the U.S. They can bomb South Korea and Japan. So Japan and South Korea, which are close U.S. allies, are incredibly angry right now. And the fact that the Trump administration is threatening genocidal extermination. We had the Defense Secretary, Mad Dog Mattis. He released a statement and he said he threatened the, quote, destruction of its people, of North Korea's people. That is, South Korea is not just sitting by while this is happening. They are furious. And fortunately, I think things will de-escalate a bit. But unfortunately, I think the U.S. that's the next target for regime change. And and this is not a conflict.
How could that happen, though? How could they actually do regime change in North Korea without actually, sort of doing an attack kind of thing? Because I can't see how that could happen. Do you?
Yeah, well, who knows? I mean, it would be very difficult. And this is
Yeah.
also one of the reasons, what's not understood.
Mm,
It's like
mm,
Cuba and other countries. One of the reasons these states are so authoritarian and the reason they're police states is because there's constant threats of foreign
mm,
overthrow. In the
yeah.
case of Cuba, I mean, Cuba is much more open than North Korea, but Cuba has certainly had, a very strong police presence, and that
Mm,
is simply because the U.S., the CIA tried to assassinate Fidel Castro
mm.
638 times between the revolution, 1959, and 2006. There,
Wow.
there's a very interesting British documentary called 638 Ways to Kill Castro. 638 times. That is a
Mm,
lot of assassination attempts. And that's not even to
yeah.
mention in 1961, the US literally invaded Cuba. The US
Mm,
blockaded Cuba, and the blockade
mm,
still exists. The
mm,
US, you know, the US trained and harbored anti-Cuban terrorists who blew up a civilian aircraft in Cuba, who
mm,
have waged a brutal war against the country for decades. And that's true
mm,
for North Korea as well. I mean, the
mm.
South Korean regime, I mean, we use the word regime for North Korea, but also South Korea. I mean, North Korea, of course, has an authoritarian government, but South Korea is only recently a democracy. South Korea also used
Yes.
to have a dictatorship backed by the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah.
So things are more complex, and we hear all these black and white pictures, and they're like, "Oh, the axis of evil, the North
Yeah.
Korean
Really.
regime." But it's like,
Mm,
yeah, I mean, I'm sure North Korea has committed its fair share of crimes, and so
sure.
has South Korea, including
Mm,
genocide in the Korean War.
yes.
And there's no context for any of that. We
Yeah.
hear these cartoon villains. But yeah, I mean, the Trump
South
administration
Korea.
has been talking about targeted assassination. I don't know if that will work, but I mean, it's clear they, or at least rhetorically, they're pushing for regime change in North Korea.
Right. And South Korea, that's a more less the last president or whatever was less and it was more pro US, wasn't it? And now this one is much less and actually wants to, do diplomatic
Peace
talks
talks.
with yeah, yeah. And speaking of regime change, there's a constant, the US empire has constantly wanted to interfere with Latin America and they've been sort
And
of
not just
trying
wanted to,
to.
but has
Yes,
directly
yes,
intervened.
exactly. Yeah. And Venezuela, there, I mean, I watched Avi Martin's and Michael Preisner's The Empire Files, and they did a number of reports from down there. And that was, it's kind of, it's really amazing. Would you like to talk a bit about Venezuela
Oh,
and
please,
what's been
absolutely.
happening there?
This is another really important issue that again is portrayed so unfairly in media reports. I'm glad you mentioned Abby and Mike. I'm good friends with both of them.
Mm,
And Abby Martin and Mike Preisner created three videos for their show, The Empire Files, on
mm,
Telesur. However, it's also important to understand that they are editorially independent because
yes.
the opposition has been like, oh, well, this is propaganda.
Yeah.
Well, no, but I mean,
Mm,
I'm friends with
mm,
them. I actually
yeah.
worked with them on an episode that they did on that we did on John Podesta
Mm,
previously, and
yes.
but for these episodes, they create their show on their own,
Mm. And
and
they
they
sell it
edit
to
it,
Telesur.
yeah, and then
Mm,
Telesur
mm,
publishes it. Um,
yeah.
and yeah, they're some of the best journalists I know. They're very good,
Yeah,
and
really.
they're also
Mm,
some of the very few journalists who have actually been on the ground inside Venezuela.
mm,
And what their films show is a few things. One, the opposition of Venezuela is not peaceful,
mm,
and
mm.
we hear
No.
again. It's surprisingly frighteningly similar to the reports that we saw on Syria in the early days of the war, the conflict there,
Mm,
which escalated into war. And there is,
mm,
unfortunately, a real possibility that the conflict in Venezuela could escalate into an all-out war. Essentially, the opposition is already waging one. So,
mm,
for some
mm,
context here, the
mm,
right-wing opposition to Venezuela, which is trying to topple the democratically elected president, Maduro, who,
mm,
again, he was democratically elected. He's not a dictator. He won an election.
mm,
And
mm,
if they actually were as democratic as they say they would wait until next year there's going to be a presidential election in 2018. But right now, Venezuela, again, as I mentioned, has been going through an economic crisis because the price of oil has plummeted more than 200%. And Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves, which is, of course, one of the reasons the U.S. is so desperate on pursuing regime change there. And it also, I mean, one of the criticisms, Chavismo, the Bolivarian revolution, since in the past 20 years, since the 1990s, the late 90s, it has accomplished a lot of very important things. Poverty has plummeted. Healthcare has been provided for citizens, education, nutrition services, literacy programs. I mean, they have really made huge dents in a lot of the problems that people faced, and shown how like millions of poor Venezuelans can be empowered and become part of the political system. One of the criticisms is the model by which they were doing that was simply taking the oil money that Venezuela had and pumping it into social services, which is a good model. I mean, the oil money should be going to benefit the Venezuelan people and not corporations.
Really?
However, one of the things is that Venezuela did not diversify its economy, and now they're going through an economic crisis. And the opposition is using that to justify the violent overthrow, essentially, of the government. Instead of waiting for elections, they have been carrying out extreme acts of violence. So, for instance, an extreme right-winger who's also a Christian fundamentalist hijacked a helicopter and he attacked the Supreme Court. He dropped grenades on the Supreme Court. He also attacked a ministry. Can you imagine in Australia or the US or the UK, or can you imagine a protester hijacking a helicopter and then attacking the Supreme Court? They would be called a terrorist. That's what they are.
Yes, really.
But in the US, the Washington Post had a headline. You know what they called that? They called it a protest flight. A protest flight. I mean, also,
seriously,
the opposition, the right-wing opposition, has bombed the Bolivarian National Guard and the police. In fact, 2 weeks ago, during the election for the Constituent Assembly, which is like a large, like more direct democratic system that ironically the opposition had previously called for. Well, in the Constituent Assembly election on that same day, in the one of the richest neighborhoods in Venezuela, in Caracas, the capital, 7 police officers were brutally burned. And there's a video of this online after they were riding their motorcycles, and then a huge bomb went off near opposition protests. They bombed police. Again, like these are not peaceful protests. Abby Martin and Mike Preisner showed how they've been organizing these large garimbas where like they will set fires in the street and blockade streets, and then they'll like fight police. They'll throw Molotov cocktails at police. There's so little nuance. So then, they set multiple people on fire. A black Chavista. I mean, also racism, like in the U.S. and other countries, Australia, racism is still a very big problem. And it's also not a coincidence that the opposition is the rich Venezuelans and largely white, and many Chavistas who support Maduro and the government. Many of them tend to be darker skinned and poor.
I didn't know that.
And in one of the protests, I mean, it's like the U.S. and many other countries where you have a history. I mean, Venezuela has a history of slavery, like many parts of Latin America, and of course institutional racism, and an Afro-Venezuelan was set on fire by opposition protesters, and they saw this color of his skin, and they saw him at their protest, and they simply assumed that there were 2 conflicting media reports. They assumed that he was either a Chavista or a thief. So either way, it doesn't reflect well in the opposition. It just shows how racist and right wing they are. And they set him on fire, and then he died. And there's horrific video of this. He's out.
I couldn't watch it.
What it reminds me of are the protests in Ukraine, and before the 2014 coup, U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine, overthrowing the elected government there, and installing a pro-West, pro-NATO, plutocratic regime. I mean, the government in Ukraine right now is basically a coalition between neo-Nazis and white supremacists and plutocrats. I mean, just oligarchs. Poroshenko, the billionaire chocolate magnate who's in charge of the country, and then the head of the parliament, the Rada, is Andrei Parobi, who's a rebranded neo-Nazi. So, yeah, I mean, there's no question that the U.S. is pursuing regime change in Venezuela. And of course, it's because you have a socialist government that was elected that has been pursuing a path independent of imperialism for 20 years, and that has the world's largest oil reserves. And I'll add one more comment here, and not blabber on too much. The CIA has made it clear. They actually admitted that they're pursuing regime change in the country. Mike Pompeo, who's the new director of the CIA, and who's much less eloquent, I'll put it that way, than previous CIA directors. Even though he's just as evil, frankly. Pompeo did an interview a few weeks ago. Thanks, Rocio. Someone commented and said, "I'm learning so much. That's great." A few weeks ago,
Rocio, isn't it?
Mike Pompeo, the CIA director, did an interview with Bret Stephens, who is the new climate science denying right-wing columnist at the New York Times. Pompeo said in this interview he did in Colorado with Mike Pompeo, Pompeo did with Stephens. Mike Pompeo admitted in the Q&A session, he said that the CIA is looking for possibilities for a new government in Venezuela. And he also admitted that the CIA recently met in Bogota, Colombia, and in Mexico City with the government there to talk about a transition in Venezuela. So he indirectly admitted that the CIA is working with Colombia and Mexico, two right-wing governments, to overthrow the Venezuelan government. I mean, it's from the horse's mouth. So it's very clear.
Amazing. It amazes me how often it's just talked about openly now. Like, we want Assad to step down so we can put in. It's like, or we want, Venezuela needs regime change. It's like, the U.S. government just sort of basically telling all these different, they're democratically elected in Venezuela, saying, oh, well, we think, you should regime change. I think the U.S. should regime change.
Well,
I mean, it's a disaster. It's I think there was a poll. It's the greatest threat to world peace is the U.S. Government. But I remember actually hearing that in Venezuela, the opposition was actually encouraging people to attack Abby Martin and Michael Preisner. Was sort of trying to incite violence against them, and literally, I think the word lynch was used, and they actually were in danger. These two journalists of for their lives, and that was sort of from one of the opposition leaders. Is that correct? Did I have that right?
I actually wrote an article about this in Alternet, and they got many death threats from some, and that's because prominent members of the opposition of Venezuela, including a professor, including a supposed journalist, including multiple supposed journalists, they spread blatant lies. They took photos from Abby Martin and Mike Preisner from their Twitter and Instagram profiles, and they spread around these photos of them reporting in Venezuela. And they took a photo in particular of them interviewing a Venezuelan government official, and then they said, "Oh, they're plotting together," and they accuse them of being spies for the Venezuelan intelligence services, and claim that they're infiltrating protests and then gathering intelligence for the Venezuelan government. These are they're blatant, outrageous lies. And then in response, they incited violence against them, and Mike and Abby got countless death threats. Many people said they would lynch them. They said even worse things. I mean, really horrific things. And not just that. Mike Preisner spoke, I think Abby too, they spoke at an event in LA where they live, Los Angeles, and Venezuelan opposition supporters in California protested. They picketed outside Mike Preisner's event. Like they actually showed up in person. Fortunately, there was no violence, but that's because they had security. So I mean, this opposition,
Can they ever go back to Venezuela? Could they ever go back and report again, or would that be just way too unsafe?
Well, I mean, they probably could, but they would have to be very careful.
Yeah, really.
I mean, again, the opposition has attacked reporters inside Venezuela, like Venezuelan reporters from Telesur. So it's not a good situation, and unfortunately, I think it's going to continue escalating. I'm really, really worried, frankly, that it could become a war. And what's ironic is
Mm.
again, it's similar to the conflict in Syria, where
Mm.
6 years into the conflict, the narrative we hear, it's repeated by everyone. They say, "Oh,
Mm.
peaceful protests began in 2011, and the brutal, bloodthirsty Assad regime just violently crushed them because it wouldn't tolerate any protests." The reality is much, much more complex. It is true that
Mm.
the Syrian government did crack down on protests, although the Bahraini regime cracked down on its protests, the Saudi regime cracked down on its protests. The U.S. government didn't care about that. The U.S. government
Mm.
supported Saudi Arabia and the UAE, sending in 2,000 troops into Bahrain to crush the protests there. And Bahrain had the
Mm.
largest protest out of any country. But in
Mm.
Syria, it is true that there was a violent clampdown, but it's also true that the protests themselves were not entirely peaceful. There were very violent protests from the beginning inside Syria, where they killed police, where they burnt down government buildings. And the same thing is true for Venezuela. You
Mm.
have opposition insurgents
Mm.
setting people on fire, burning down government buildings. I mean, not only did they attack the Supreme Court with a helicopter, 2 weeks before that, they set the Supreme Court on fire. I mean, these are very extreme actions.
Really?
And what's really funny is U.S. media outlets are 100% pro-opposition. They're
Mm.
now using the word
Yeah.
regime. Some outlets have
Yeah.
even called Maduro a dictator,
Yeah.
and it's just so biased. But what's
Yeah.
even more funny, what's actually just frankly hilarious,
Mm.
is like the Guardian recently, the major British newspaper, published an article, and the Washington Post also did. They published articles interviewing protesters, and the
Yeah.
protesters explicitly said that they're at war with the government. The Washington Post published a really long, like basically PR story for the Venezuelan
Mm.
opposition, and it
Mm.
interviewed all these activists in Venezuela, and they
Mm.
literally said, "We're at war with the government." And then the Washington Post article talked about all the weapons they have, like Molotov
Mm.
cocktails, all these like swords and stuff. I mean, they're literally, in their own words, they say they're waging a war against the
Yeah.
elected government. And the response
Yes.
of the media is, "Oh, the evil Maduro dictatorship, blah, blah, blah." I mean, it's so biased and unfair.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even yeah. I mean, the last what was his name? Chavez. I mean,
Yeah, Chavez.
they sort of went on and on about him being a dictator and everything. They basically constantly vilify the mainstream media. Constantly vilify. It's like the U.S. is sort of the sane and kind of democratic country, and then everybody else is sort of like these. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah, I'll
dictators
add
or
one thing
whatever.
if I can,
Yes. Yes.
on this issue. Um, in 2013, when Chavez passed away, and for context, Hugo Chavez won 6 elections and referenda. Like,
Mm.
not only did he win elections, he kept winning elections, and then the right-wing opposition would be like, "That election wasn't fair. We need a referendum." So then they would do a referendum, and he would win again,
Mm.
6 times, again
Six
and again and
times.
again
Yeah.
and again. Um,
Do you think that he was, there was a talk that there could have possibly been some weaponized cancer thing about, uh, that his sort of death and stuff. I don't know, but anyway, that was just something that I heard that there might have been some weaponized
yeah, I mean,
cancer
I
in
don't know.
it.
I mean,
It's
he
who
did die
knows.
very young, but
Mm.
that's
Yeah.
something I'm not going to speculate about. I
Yeah,
mean,
sure. It's
there's
speculation. I was just going to say about the
well, wait, sorry,
Brazil.
I was going to add one more
Oh,
thing. I'm
sorry.
sorry,
Yes.
I keep
Yes.
blabbering on here,
No
but
worries. No, that's
uh,
fine.
the comparisons between the way media outlets discussed Chavez,
Mm.
comparing him to Pinochet, the U.S.-backed Chilean dictator, or
Mm.
King Abdullah from Saudi Arabia, it's
Mm.
so hilarious. So, as an
Mm.
example, a colleague at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting wrote an article. The media watchdog I write for, he wrote an article after King Abdullah died, the Saudi king,
Mm. Mm.
comparing the way the U.S. media, and this was several months after Chavez died, comparing the
Mm.
way the U.S. media reported on King Abdullah's death and Chavez's
Mm.
death.
Mm.
Media outlets referred to Chavez as a dictator, even though he was democratically elected. Um,
Mm.
they they said he left behind like a horrible legacy, blah 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 blah
Mm.
blah. And
Mm.
then when the Saudi absolute monarch, the dictator who oversees a brutal extremist theocratic regime in which women are not equal citizens, in which
Mm.
peaceful dissidents are beheaded, in which
Mm.
Shia citizens are currently being besieged. Well,
Mm.
the Saudi king was a reformer, according to the U.S. media. They said that he
Yeah, right.
fought for women's rights and he was a
Yes.
progressive reformer in a conservative
Mm,
kingdom. I mean,
mm.
it's just like,
I know.
you know, the hypocrisy is
Yeah,
so outrageous. I mean,
I know.
and we see this today with Brazil. I mean,
Mm,
people don't really know.
mm,
A lot of Americans and other people don't really, if they don't follow closely. Brazil has a dictator right now. I mean, he's not
Tema.
technically a dictator, but he basically is a dictator. The
Mm,
current president of Brazil, Michel Temer, he was not elected. He was actually barred from running for office. He literally
mm,
cannot run for president because he was found guilty in court.
mm,
And and not only was he unelected, he was installed through a kind of soft coup that ousted
mm.
the previous elected left-wing leader, Dilma Rousseff,
Yes.
in
Mm,
which she explicitly called a coup, and she was ousted on charges that were not even impeachable, on supposed corruption charges, even though the current president, Michel Temer, is under investigation for blatant bribery, and there's recordings of him, literal recordings of him admitting to being involved in this corruption. So then we hear
yeah,
constant
yeah,
the Maduro dictatorship. What about the Temer
yeah,
dictatorship?
yeah,
No, the
really.
reality is the U.S. loves the right-wing unelected leader in Brazil, but they
Yes.
despise the elected left-wing leader in Venezuela.
Yes, that's the case, isn't it? Often with the US and their attitude towards other democratic, any country that hasn't buckled under and submitted to them is basically under threat in a way. I
Oh,
mean,
and the UK
you have
too.
no,
The UK did
yes,
the same.
yes,
And
yes.
Jeremy Corbyn got in a bunch of trouble recently for
Mm,
he released a statement of Venezuela and he pointed out
mm,
that violence has been caused by both sides. And everyone
mm,
was like, "You dictator apologist, blah blah blah."
Yeah, really. Um, Apparently, I read that they weren't going to go ahead with a prosecution with Temer. They sort of decided not to
Hmm.
do that, which is sort of Teflon Temer. It kind of came to mind, you know. But like, wasn't there another on the opposition on the Dilma Rousseff's? I can't remember the name of that party. He's actually
The
going to be
Workers'
put
Party.
away in prison. He was actually
Lula.
yeah. What was his name? Sorry.
Lula.
Lula, yeah. Isn't he is he going away to prison now? They've sort of I think they've actually trumped up something with him. I don't think
Oh yeah.
it's
I mean, these
there's
charges are
any
also
basis to
extremely, they're very exaggerated.
yeah.
Well, that's being appealed. I mean, we'll see what happens. It's
Mm,
not definite
mm,
yet. And
yeah.
the Workers' Party has vowed to fight that.
Yeah.
So that's not lost hope yet. But it
Mm,
also again underscores the incredible hypocrisy where the very
yeah.
popular former left-wing leader Lula might be
Mm,
going to prison for corruption, while
mm.
the actual current
Yes.
right-wing unelected president is on recording admitting
Mm,
being involved in corruption and admitting being involved with uh, the former congressperson inside Brazil who is currently being
mm,
imprisoned on corruption
mm.
charges.
Yeah, I know.
It's just
It's just
the double
unbelievable, isn't
standards
it?
are so
It
crazy.
sort of does your head in after a while when you see this, you know what I mean? It's just I don't know. Sometimes sometimes I feel sorry for independent journalists. Like you must sometimes read stuff and just go, you know what I mean? Your head must want to explode. I was just going to also you know how we were going to get back to Qatar. I'm not sure exactly. Some say Qatar and I say Qatar. I don't know. But anyway, and we were talking about how there's going to be. It looks like they're going to regime change, and Qatar is sort of like friendly with Iran, and Iran is like almost like Cinderella. Everybody they're constantly vilifying everybody, vilifying Iran. And what has Iran done? Do you know what I mean? And anyway, Qatar is sort of friendly with Iran, and I think that Saudi Arabia has a problem with that. And also, I don't think Qatar is greatly enamored by the Saudi-Israel alliance, and then I think there's a military base in Qatar, and so the military aren't very happy that Trump is kind of being sort of carrying, has basically almost like been a catalyst for this the Saudis turning on Qatar. Anyway, you're the one who knows more than I do, but if you could just talk about Qatar, Ben,
No,
that'd be
I think
great.
you raised a lot of important points.
Mm,
First of all, just to preface all of this, it's important to understand that actually Qatar, it's in Arabic, it's Qatar, but just Qatar.
Koto.
Um,
Okay.
Qatar actually doesn't necessarily have very close ties to Iran. It has
Oh,
normal ties to Iran. Kuwait and Oman, of the Gulf countries, Kuwait and Oman have much closer ties to Iran, but they haven't been blockaded. So the excuse that the Saudi Arabia and the UAE are using to blockade Qatar, claiming that it is close to Iran,
Mm.
that
Mm.
doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
Mm.
Again, Qatar has said that they'll work with anyone. They do have economic and political ties to Iran, but not unusual ones. Um,
Mm.
I think there are some other reasons afoot. One, uh, the Saudi Emirati blockade of Qatar did not begin until after Trump's visit to Saudi Arabia. And
Mm.
this talk about things that are outrageous and crazy. I mean,
Mm.
being a journalist, I mean, in the age of Trump, I mean, I was kind of
Mm.
desensitized to stuff in the age of Obama, but in the age of Trump,
Mhm.
you never know what things just get crazier and crazier.
Yeah.
And when Trump visited Saudi Arabia and he did saber dancing, he like danced with swords with the Saudi king. And
Oh,
then the
yeah.
funniest thing I've ever seen in my entire life, really,
Mm.
is the orb photo. I don't know if you saw
Yes,
that.
yes, I know. I've seen that on your Twitter page. It's so great, isn't it? It's just like straight out of a movie with the orb.
Well,
I like the way you use that for the moderate rebels. I think that's hilarious.
yeah, I have a podcast with
Mm.
journalist Max
Yes,
Blumenthal, and we have a funny cartoon version of that, spoof of that.
great.
Well,
Yes.
after his trip to Saudi Arabia, in which Trump pledged to sell $110 billion to the extremist regime in Saudi Arabia, which has supported ISIS and Al Qaeda.
Mm.
Well, it was after Trump returned from his trip, that's when the blockade of Qatar began. And it's very clear that Saudi Arabia was doing this at the approval of the US. Now, why they're doing it, I think there are a few different reasons. One, Qatar is a very convenient scapegoat. It is true that Qatar has supported extremist groups, including Al Qaeda and ISIS, just like Saudi Arabia. Both of
Mm.
them, a 2014 email from Hillary Clinton, released by WikiLeaks, acknowledges that close U.S. allies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, were supporting ISIS. That is
Mm.
that
Mm.
is not
Yes, yes.
contestable. That is a fact.
Mm.
Well,
Mm.
Saudi Arabia and the US have launched a kind of convenient strategy of scapegoating Qatar for what they both did. So then Saudi Arabia can say, "Oh, it wasn't us, it was them." And there was actually a meme going around, which is very accurate, and it's like a frame from Spider-Man, and it has like two Spider-Man, like white Spider-Man and another Spider-Man, they're pointing at each other, and like that
Right,
is a very good like humorous kind of symbol for what's going on. I mean,
right.
Qatar has not done anything that Saudi Arabia hasn't done, and Qatar,
Yes.
I mean, Qatar is a pretty authoritarian. It is 100% an authoritarian monarchy, but
Mm.
it's less authoritarian than Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. has no problem working hand in glove with Saudi Arabia. So that's
Mm.
part of it. Another
Mm.
part of it is Al Jazeera. I mean, for all of its problems, and it does have
Mm.
problems, Al Jazeera is a very important media source in the Middle East, in a
Mm.
region where basically all media outlets are controlled by the state. And Al Jazeera has done a lot of really good reporting, especially on Israel Palestine.
Mm.
It's very an indispensable voice for covering
Right.
Israeli atrocities, which
Mm.
don't get much attention, and
Mm.
also covering some other issues from a different perspective.
Mm.
Al Arabiya, which is the basically Saudi state media. I mean, it's owned by the Saudi royal family media
Mm.
outlet. They are not as harsh. They're not as critical in their reporting, and they're not that as influential. So one of the
Mm.
demands that Saudi Arabia has imposed upon Qatar is the end to Al Jazeera, which is not going to happen. They're not going to close that.
Right.
And then another factor in this is the relations between the Gulf and other parts of the Middle East. So
Mm.
Qatar has spent huge sums of money, probably billions of dollars, trying to
Mm.
overthrow the Syrian government. And Qatar
Mm.
was working with the US and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, supporting rebels in Syria, including extremists linked to Al Qaeda. Well, Turkey has took the side of Qatar because the other really major issue to understand this is Qatar is a strong supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood. And
Mm.
I'm certainly not a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood. They're a right
Yes.
wing organization, but they're not Al Qaeda. They're very
Mm.
different.
Mm.
The Muslim
Mm.
Brotherhood believes in working through democratic mechanisms. And, they vote in elections, etc. again, I'm not a fan of them. They're a right-wing religious party, but
mm,
Saudi Arabia considers the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, not because
mm,
they're actually, I mean, Saudi Arabia supports terrorists. They don't care about that. The reason they consider them
mm,
a terrorist organization is because the Muslim Brotherhood threatens the Saudi monarchy's hold on power.
mm,
And also the UAE, another monarchy, also considers the Muslim Brotherhood to be a terrorist organization
right,
because, again, they're an absolute monarchy, and the Muslim Brotherhood threatens their hold on power.
right,
Well, Qatar is a very strong supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood.
mm, mm,
And they supported the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, in Palestine. I mean, Hamas
mm,
is the Palestinian wing of the Muslim Brotherhood.
mm,
So that is actually another really important thing underlying a lot of this. Turkey
right,
is governed by Erdogan, who's basically a dictator. I mean, he's very
yeah,
authoritarian,
mm,
um, and he is the leader of what was, I mean, it's still basically the Turkish wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, the AKP.
right,
And he is allied with Qatar, and Turkey sent troops into Qatar. So I know this sounds pretty complex, but basically what we're seeing is the division of the Middle East. There are no longer just two axes. There are three axes. There is
right,
the resistance axis. So Iran, Syria, Lebanon / Hezbollah, and Palestine. The countries that
mm,
resist U.S. military aggression, and also Israel. And
mm,
then another axis that's emerged is this axis that's kind of in between, which is
mm,
Turkey and Qatar, Kuwait and Oman, kind of a bit. And some countries can kind of go back and forth that
mm,
sometimes will play both sides. And then you have the
mm,
Gulf. So you have Saudi Arabia, the UAE, the US, and Egypt kind of flips, but Egypt's mostly on that side. And they're
mm,
all closely allied with Israel. And Saudi
mm,
Arabia at this point is basically, everyone knows they're allied with Israel. They basically
mm,
work together. So, like
mm,
you said, Qatar isn't entirely on board with that. I mean,
mm,
Qatar has supported Palestinian resistance. They're not
mm,
some noble, they're not like Venezuela. They don't have a progressive anti-imperialist government, but
sure,
they're not entirely on board, and they're not just following orders. And that's, of
right,
course, why they're currently being blockaded.
right, right, I see. And the in relation to Iran, like, do you think that like if they actually do regime change in Qatar, and is this sort of like a step towards basically eventually, as Bill Kristol said, the neocon
Mm.
Bill Kristol on Twitter, he said
Iran is the
Iran
prize.
is the prize, and there's been this sort of gradual, it almost like just knocking at one country after another in the Middle East, and that eventually, Iran is just like a matter of time before something dreadful is going to happen to Iran. And I just wonder, like, like, I don't know, what is it like? Um, I don't know. Iran just seems to be this constant, just constantly vilified. Is that because they basically threw out the Shah, and and the US has never forgiven them? I mean, is it they're the dictator that the US
Yeah,
admits to having?
yeah, that's certainly a big part of it. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the revolution is just, it sets a very dangerous precedent. Dangerous for the U.S., not for the people of the region. I mean, it sets a good precedent for the people of the region, but it
Mm-hmm.
shows that they don't have to deal with these imperialist, propped up proxy regimes that are these monarchies and dictatorships that control their lives. It shows that they can actually, you know, create a revolution and create a new government. Again,
Mm-hmm.
that doesn't mean that the Iranian government is ideal. There are a lot of issues with the Iranian government. I mean, I do not support theocracy, but it's also not fair to compare Iran to its neighbors.
Mm-hmm.
Iran and Saudi Arabia are not the same thing at all. At all. Again,
Mm-hmm.
Iran is a theocracy, and there's a lot to criticize about Iran. Iran is
Mm-hmm.
also a republic. It is the Islamic Republic. They just elected a president, Rouhani, who's a reformist. He was reelected. They had 73% voter turnout, nearly three-quarter voter turnout. Uh, he won within a landslide. He's a reformist. He's very popular, especially among the youth, and he's trying to open things up a bit. So Iran is making steady reforms.
Mm-hmm.
It's not Iran has female politicians. Women have, again, they face discrimination in society. Some
mm,
religious and ethnic minorities do face discrimination in Iran, but it's not like Saudi
mm,
Arabia. I mean, these are not
mm,
comparisons. Anyway, so one of the things that Iran poses in terms of a threat to the US, it's not
mm,
actually a threat,
mm.
but
No.
one of the things is the threat of a good example. Iran
Yeah.
shows that a country with 80 million people and enormous oil reserves and a large economy can
Mm,
create a government that is independent, that does not simply follow what the US wants, and especially
mm,
that is not allied with Israel. That is, of
mm,
course, one of the biggest parts of this. So not only did Iran launch a revolution, but Iran has been one of the only countries to consistently support Palestinian resistance against
mm,
the illegal Israeli occupation, against brutal Israeli war crimes and military, interventions inside Gaza.
mm,
So
mm, mm,
that's a big part of it. Iran
mm,
also supports Hezbollah. Hezbollah
mm,
in 2006 uh, essentially kicked Israel out of Lebanon. Israel invaded Lebanon,
mm,
in a horrific war in which Israel dropped more than 1 million cluster bomblets. Um,
mm.
and still today, people are being killed and injured by the cluster bombs that Israel had dropped.
Yeah.
And Hezbollah is strongly supported by Iran. Hezbollah is one of the
Mm,
only remaining forces in the Middle East that still is engaged in an armed conflict against
mm,
Israel.
mm,
And of course, Iran also supported Hamas,
mm.
which has also been fighting Israel when every 2 or 3 years Israel invades Gaza and begins bombing civilians. And so that's a big part of it. By refusing to be incorporated into the US, Israeli, Saudi Arabian axis,
Mm,
Iran poses a threat. And it's not because they actually pose a real threat. Iran has
mm,
never actually posed a threat to American civilians, unlike Al Qaeda and
mm,
ISIS.
mm,
Iran doesn't target civilians.
yeah.
Iran is a country that is engaged in its own diplomatic, processes. And
Mm,
the nuclear deal, there's a lot to criticize about Obama. That was one of the good things he did. The Trump
mm,
administration is trying, it says itself, Trump says they're trying to tear up the agreement, even though they
yeah.
have admitted twice, reluctantly, but they've
Mm,
admitted that Iran has been uh, in accordance with the agreement. Iran has
yeah.
not violated the
Mm,
GCPOA at all.
mm,
Iran has been
mm,
following its requirements under the agreement, and it's the US which
yeah.
is trying to break it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, um, I was going to say about the speaking of bombs, etc. I was just wanting to do you know much about the that living under drones? It was a joint study conducted over 9 months by law schools at
Stanford.
Stanford University in New York. And what kind of things could you say it revealed? That do you know much about the living under drones report?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very important report. It was done
Mm,
by the legal forums at Stanford Law and here in New York, and it interviewed people inside Pakistan who have lived under the horror flying above them. That is the
mm,
U.S. drone program. It's
mm,
really important to get the perspective of these people who frequently we don't hear from. Um,
mm,
and unfortunately, when we do hear from them, so for instance, there was a case a few years back, I remember, I think this might have been 2014, maybe earlier, in which some Pakistani children came to the US Congress to testify about what their experience was living under drones. And
mm.
I don't remember the exact number, but almost no Congress people showed up. Like you can count the
Right.
number of Congress people on your hands who showed up. It was like
Wow.
fewer than 5 or something. Um,
Wow.
but this report gives the perspective of people who not only have had family members killed or wounded by drone strikes, and of
Mm,
course, that is a very important thing to consider. Hundreds, probably thousands of civilians, I mean, definitely thousands of civilians have been killed in drone attacks. Um, the Bureau of Investigative Journalism has compiled a very detailed list of drone attacks in different countries. That that list is very conservative in its estimates. The actual numbers are probably much higher. Well, living under drones takes a step further, and it provides a perspective that I think is very important because they don't only interview people who have been wounded in drone strikes or who knew family members who were killed, they also interview people who have not maybe directly been affected. They maybe haven't been wounded or had family members who are killed, but who have to live psychologically under a covert drone war, where above you, invisible in the sky, are flying around are flying robots that can bomb you and your family and your loved ones at any moment. Living with that fear, that psychological dread every single day of your life, it's unfathomable. Just like constantly worrying that today could be your last day, and you're an average civilian. You're not involved with the Taliban. You're not blah blah blah. But just that fear, and that's what this report is really important, because if you read Living Under Drones, it really gives you insight into what average Pakistanis are feeling, and just how, you know, that dread is, it's all encompassing. It's really dreadful.
Do you think that, you know, the American public, a lot of the American public don't seem to be very interested in what happens, their government's doing to, you know, to brown people overseas? That seems to be the case. And I just sort of wonder, like, is it because they don't have a lot of people in the United States don't seem to have a real, because all the wars are done elsewhere, and there's, you know, it's sort of like it's sanitized, it's all over there, and they've never really had to kind of have anything, they don't really know what it's like. I mean, that's part of it, of course, but like, I just wonder why the US is sort of, a lot of citizens just take no interest in that, the millions of people that are being killed by their government. It just doesn't seem to be, like, I notice even on social media that a lot of US citizens, they never post anything, disseminate any information that's independent journalism about anything. They don't seem to show any interest whatsoever in it. It's kind of appalling in a way. Do you know what I mean? I just don't understand why that is. I mean, is it a deep-seated racism, or, you know, because it can't be cluelessness, because I mean, there's plenty of internet. You know, in the days of internet, you know, ignorance is a choice, really. So I just sort of wonder, you know, like, why that is. Anyway.
However, still, the information is very tightly controlled. People don't know what to believe. They're confused. And I understand that. It is confusing. There's a lot to disbelieve. And there is a lot of good alternative media out there, but there's also bad alternative media out there. Like InfoWars. InfoWars is a lot of damage. InfoWars is not a good alternative to CNN. They both are horrible in different ways.
I've watched a couple of InfoWars things, and honestly, it's like, I've never taken acid, but I mean, honestly, just watching it, it's nuts. It's nuts. It's just, for want of a better word, it's nuts. I mean, you know, it's just, it's like, wow. It's not. I sometimes I think a lot of people might tune in just to see what kind of crazy stuff's going on there. You know what I mean? Oh, sorry to interrupt.
I think that's partially why they do some of that stuff. So
yeah.
So like the point I was making with that is that, I mean, InfoWars is the extreme example, but not all. It is true that not all alternative media is reliable. There is actual fake news, and it's CNN publishes a lot of fake news, but there are. So I understand why people are confused, and people don't really trust anything, and I understand that. Like the American faith in the media, I think it's like at 7% or something, and that's understandable. So I think that partially explains why people don't post about the stuff. They don't really know about what's going on. But then there's also people. There's this perception that what's going on abroad is complex, and hopefully, I mean, I know I talked in things in great detail today, so hopefully I don't actually propagate that, because I actually want to. Well, no, because I want to provide the opposite conclusion. I want people to understand that what's going on abroad is actually not that complex. There are complexities and nuances, but at the end of the day, the conflict in Israel-Palestine is pretty simple. The war in Yemen is pretty simple. The conflict in Venezuela is pretty simple. Like, these are not that complex. But even when people do try to find information about it, I think there's sometimes they're dismayed because they think things have a huge learning curve, and they think that they're going to have to spend all this time trying to figure out what's actually happening. And that's not the case. So I think part of that is the fault of, people like me and journalists. I think we need to do a better job of simplifying things and making it more accessible. And then finally, it's that lack of prioritization of the victims of US empire. It's a reflection of the government itself. So I don't really blame the American people that much in the same way that I blame the government. How many politicians talk about these things? They might talk about Syria, but how many of them talk about Palestinians? No one talks about Palestinians. How many of them talk about Yemenis? How many of them talk about, the plight of people, of the Pakistanis living under drones? You can count the number of US politicians who talk about them on your hand. So Bernie Sanders, who has a lot of issues, but he, on foreign policy, which is he's pretty weak on, but he's also spoken out about some issues. He spoke out about Palestine, and that was very commendable. Then
he threw them under the bus with signing that letter with those 100 senators.
So he's not perfect, but during his campaign, in the Brooklyn debate here, he spoke out in support of Palestinian rights against Hillary Clinton, and that was brave of him. He didn't have to do that. Also, there are politicians there aren't that many. I mean, we can criticize him.
And his Russia, his constant, vilifying Russia.
Well, also,
oh, God.
His comments, he called Chavez a dead communist dictator, which is ridiculous. I mean, Chavez, again, was democratically elected. So, no, I mean, Bernie's not perfect. But I'm saying in the context of U.S. politics, he did help make some progress. I mean, U.S. politics is so right-wing. It's so repressive. It's so corporate controlled, Wall Street funded.
He did change the narrative, didn't he? He certainly did put out some,
And then there are a few other people. I mean, again, someone who's much worse, who has more problems, Chris Murphy, another congressman here. He's talked about the war in Yemen. He's talked about these other issues. Even Rand Paul. Rand Paul is a libertarian-leaning Republican, but even he, for instance, has opposed U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. He has, spoken out about the war in Yemen. There are some voices, but they're 1% of our elected officials. So, I mean, it does concern me that Americans don't really know what's going on, but I don't really blame them. There's so much confusion. The media is not helping them. What I blame is the government, and I especially, not just the government as a blob, I especially blame elected officials, because the U.S. claims to be a democracy, which it certainly is not. I mean, it's a dictatorship of the rich, of the 1%. The U.S. claims to be a democracy, and we have elected officials, so we need to hold them accountable. And if they're not speaking out on behalf of the victims,
they're supposed to be public servants. They're supposed to be public servants.
And they're derelict in their duties. And those are the people I really, really blame. And as a journalist, I think, I'm trying to educate people as much as I can. I'm trying to, spread the word about what's going on. But again, like the real culprits are the people who actually have power.
I was thinking, I don't know how this is ever going to change though in the US, because you don't have like a preferential voting, like a ranked choice system, and also those electronic machines can be hacked, and also the DNC basically has already, it appears, decided who they're going to put in for 2020, and they're not even pretending now they're going to have any primaries or anything. I mean, it's just sort of like, and also now Trump has put the election thing in the hands of Homeland Security, the infrastructure of that, which means, I just can't see how those two major parties are ever going to be, which they're pretty much the same. They're just, you know, they're just serving their corporate masters or whatever, and there's really no difference. They play good cop, bad cop sort of thing, but it's just sort of, you know, it's just a pretense. So I don't see how this is going to end. I don't think it's going to end well, because I think something, you know what I mean? I just can't see how it's ever going to be a change in that two-party stranglehold kind of thing. Do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, I
Is there
think,
any?
well, I like the term revolutionary optimism. I have a revolutionary optimism. I think that we're at a really bad point, not just in the US, but globally. Global politics are really
Yes.
bad right now.
Yeah.
Australia, and then
Yeah.
there are some glimmers of hope. Jeremy Corbyn is a major glimmer of hope.
Yes.
Other
Mm.
countries. And I think there
Mm.
is a very real potential for not just
Mm.
progressive, but for radical change. And
Yes.
frankly, I think it's inevitable. Not only is it
Yeah, right. Oh,
possible, it's
good.
inevitable. You know, there are
Oh,
different
that's good,
periods of,
Ben.
well, there are different
That's good.
periods. There are different periods of history where things get so bad, and then there are revolutions.
Mm. Right. Right.
Do I think the U.S. is going to have a revolution? Who knows? Probably not the U.S., but other countries.
Mm.
But
Neoliberalism is kind of falling, though, isn't it? Like the UK has shown that people are really tired of the austerity thing, and you know, like his slogan, Corbyn's slogan, you know, for the many, not the few. I mean, they really have kind of embraced that, and I think he if it's his to lose next election, you know, sort of thing, basically. And if he gets in, I think that will actually make things will start to topple. You know, that 100th monkey theory. You know, things might start to sort of. I think people are getting very, very sick and tired of the. You know, they can see pretty clearly now. I mean, 5 people now own more wealth than half the world's population. I mean, it's just totally, you know, outrageous. And so, yeah, and I've noticed also, I was reading just the other day that most young people don't get their news anymore from those mainstream media in England who are in UK who are
good.
just you know, they're just outrageous. And so they actually, in fact, they actually get their news from things like the Canary on social media,
Oh,
the
cool.
Canary. And most people under 35 do that. So I think, you know, the Murdoch and the rest of them, their days are kind of numbered in that they're losing their grip, which is excellent. Here in Australia, it's not so good. Things are just not great at all, really. We've got a media, even the ABC, which was, you know, reasonable, is just, it's all fallen in. And the two major parties are just pretending to, you know, it's sort of similar to the United States, not as out there, but it's getting that way. So unfortunately, we're behind in lots of things, including this whole marriage equality thing, which is just you know, just really, I can't believe it. Anyway,
Yeah.
but anyway, that you know, that's heartening in a way. Yeah, it could be the case that it just kind of suddenly goes the other way. I mean, it is getting that bad. People are sort of really struggling now to live. I mean, we have homelessness now in Australia that we never had, like 20. We didn't have in to the extent, you know, it's sort of really getting very difficult for people. So yeah, things hopefully will change and sort of start going the other way. I hope there isn't, like in the United States, it doesn't become a bloody sort of a revolution. You know what I mean? But it could go that way because there's a lot of right wing sort of people with a lot of guns. There's some people that have a lot of guns.
So many. Well, yeah, I mean, fortunately, I don't foresee violence in the near future in the U.S. I mean, well, let's be clear. There already is violence, but
yes,
the level of a war, I don't see that happening. But and also, when I say revolutionary change, I mean I don't see the U.S. being the center of that, but I think other parts of the world. Also, it's important to understand that while it is true that the far right is on the rise, and this is a very, very dangerous development, Donald Trump is not unique, right? In France, you had Marine Le Pen. In the Netherlands, you have here Wilders. You have these far right, you know, vehemently racist, very anti-Muslim parties that are growing. At the same time, though, what gets less attention is you have a lot of left-wing movements that are growing, including socialist movements.
Mm.
This is true in Germany. This is true in France. The French election was just held, and it was unfortunately, it was miserable. It was between a far right bigot and between a former banker neoliberal centrist, Macron.
Mm.
However, that was the second round. What got less attention, especially in non-French language media, is that in the first round of the French election, there was a very popular socialist who wanted to withdraw France from NATO, who wanted to end France's involvement in foreign wars, and even leave the EU.
Oh,
His name was
yes.
Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Mélenchon
Yeah.
actually, he wasn't that far from winning second place. I think, I don't
Mm.
remember the exact figures, but he was
Mm.
something like 500,000 votes, which actually
Mm.
wasn't that much. He was pretty close. He was only like
Wow.
3 or 4% behind the second place, which happened to be Marine Le Pen. So, and also he was kind of sabotaged by the Socialist Party in France, which it's called the Socialist Party, but it's not
Right.
socialist. It's
It's
neoliberal.
pretend.
Um, and
Faux socialist.
and they ran a candidate named Hamon, and if he had dropped out, Mélenchon might have actually won the first round of the election, and he could have been a presidential contender against Macron. So
Right.
we shouldn't be too dismayed. I
Right.
mean, U.S. politics, it's uniquely bad. I mean, things are bad in Australia and other places, but
Yeah. Yeah.
like you said, our electoral system here is set up to prevent any other party from ever being allowed to take power.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
fighting that stranglehold is going to be difficult. It's going to take a long time. I think it's possible. I mean, so as an example, historically, the Whig Party used to be the Democratic Party and the Whig Party were the two major parties in the U.S. Most
Yeah.
people don't even know what the Whig Party is anymore because it was destroyed. It no longer exists. The Republicans took its place. And the Republicans,
Yeah.
ironically, this is actually very strange historically. The Republicans used to be a kind of very progressive, kind of almost radical party. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was part of it, right?
Yes.
And now it's a very right-wing extreme party. So, yeah, I mean, we shouldn't be pessimistic. We should be realistic about the reality of the political situation, but understand that the Occupy movement, which was just 6 years ago, had
Yes.
an enormous impact. Black Lives
Yeah.
Matter, which is still happening. The
Yes.
Palestine Solidarity Movement. These are really
Yes.
big movements that are growing, and
Right.
and I think that they're good signs for the future. Like things are going to
Yeah.
get better. They're really bad right now, but they're going to get
Oh,
better.
you're making me feel much better, Ben. Because sometimes I just, I wake up and I just look at some of it and I just think, oh, Uh, but I was just going to ask you. I realize that we're sort of. I've had you here for almost 2 hours now, so I probably should wind it up soon. But I'm really enjoying it, and I really appreciate you taking your time. Ben's got to
Oh, my
go
pleasure.
on a trip
Good
this
question.
afternoon, and I just wanted to ask you, how do you think things are going to, and how, like, do you think the BDS campaign, it is sort of taking hold, but the US is trying to vilify and actually bring into law some things that will stop people, make it illegal for people to, and fine them huge fines. I think it's like $1 million or some ridiculous fine. I'm just wondering if you feel that is this the way it's going to end? This apartheid situation, this brutal occupation of Palestine. The BDS, or because it's getting. I mean, basically they're under such stress now. The Palestinians. It's going to take a while for that to take hold. That BDS thing, and what's going to happen in the meantime with the Palestinians, sort of thing.
Yeah, for those who don't know, BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. This is a global movement that was called for by Palestinians, modeled after the boycott movement that ended apartheid in South Africa, or that helped end apartheid in South Africa. I mean, also there was an armed struggle in South Africa. The ANC was the one that really ended apartheid, but the international movement really helped. And the BDS campaign globally is having a really big impact already. And that is why we're seeing this kind of legislation. The Israeli government created its own department devoted to countering BDS. That's how terrified they are of it. So that's a good sign. Natan Sharansky, who is a very senior Israeli politician who is a former minister, Natan Sharansky has referred to he used the word battle, the battle against BDS is a kind of war. I mean, he uses this warlike language. I mean, it's the fact that Israeli politicians are terrified is a sign of how effective it is. And not just, I mean, honestly, in the US, BDS is growing, but it's actually much more influential in Europe. Parts of Australia, I know, I mean, it's not as big in Australia, but it's growing. And in other parts of the world, South Africa actually has an enormous BDS movement. And there's a lot of solidarity between Black South Africans and Palestinians. In the US, the fact that politicians are trying to illegalize it is actually, I think, having the opposite impact. It's fueling BDS. It's making it more well-known and more popular. And people are saying, whoa, wait, this new legislation that more than half of senators supported will imprison me? Because like you mentioned, part of the punishment of this new legislation that's being considered, fortunately, I don't think it'll go through, the Anti-Israel Boycott Act. But what's interesting about this legislation is it could punish people with a maximum of 20 years in prison. So they're talking about imprisoning people for supporting a boycott called for by Palestinians on behalf of Palestinian rights. That has actually created a huge scandal here. And a lot of people who didn't even know about BDS, they now know about it because of that.
Right.
So
people actually heard about, have people actually heard about that? Because I'm surprised people even realize that that's gone, that's on the table sort of thing.
It actually got mainstream media attention. So I live in New York City. Here in New York, our governor, who is a Democrat but who's very right wing, and his name's Cuomo. He actually is probably going to be running for president. Unfortunately, it's going to be bad.
Oh God!
But he and Mark Zuckerberg, the billionaire. Well, Cuomo recently passed an executive order in New York State that that forbids institutions that get funding from the government to support BDS, and if they do, they'll be defunded. And the reason he passed an executive order is because the New York legislature had tried to pass legislation, anti-BDS legislation, and it didn't go through. So then he just undemocratically he just signed an order. The New York Civil Liberties Union, the New York wing of the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, they expressly said that this is unconstitutional and violates the First Amendment, freedom of speech. I think the fact that you have all these legal organizations fighting back, that's a very good sign. They're not going to allow this to happen, even though some states have passed this kind of legislation. But even those local level bills, they have not gotten that much attention. This national bill has actually gotten a lot of attention, partially just because you have a majority of senators who no longer support, fortunately, but who previously supported a bill that would imprison people for exercising their constitutional right to boycott. This is just so outrageous, and it shows how desperate they've gotten. Israel is on the defensive; it's no longer on the offensive. People throughout the U.S. and throughout the world are beginning to see that this is an apartheid state. There's no denying the fact. The UN, actually, a UN agency, recently released a report co-authored by the former UN Special Rapporteur, Richard Falk, and he and another co-author wrote this report arguing from a legal perspective about how Israel is an apartheid state, using a strict legal definition. Unfortunately, because of pressure by the U.S. government, the UN pressured this UN agency to withdraw the report. You can still find it online. I wrote about it for Alternet. But the fact that you have prominent UN officials and experts speaking out about this, expressly saying that Israel is an apartheid state that is engaged in ethnic cleansing against Palestinians, this is a very significant development. It shows that things are really spiraling out of control for Israel. And the only way that Israel can hold on to its regime inside Israel-Palestine is through these incredibly anti-democratic mechanisms. And it's blowing up in its face.
Well, that's good. That's really good. Good to know, actually. And I just finally, Ben, we might wind it up here, and it's been really a pleasure to have you on because you're so knowledgeable about all these issues. It's really great. But I was just wondering how you think it's going to play out with this whole. I feel like the US is thinking about definitely wanting to, sort of in some way invade China and Russia, and I just sort of wonder how you feel that's sort of going to play out, because that's going to be a disaster if they keep going with, and they really, really want to, which I don't know, it's like it seems like they really, really want to invade Russia and China, and I just wonder,
Yeah, well, I mean, that would be so catastrophic.
wouldn't it?
It'd be worse. I mean, it would be
Yeah,
World War
yeah.
III. It would be so bad. I don't
Mm,
even want to speculate on that. I'll say
mm,
that, frankly, I don't think that the U.S. is going to invade Russia or
mm,
China.
mhm,
What's equally dangerous, however, and a very real potential, is a prospective proxy war. Syria has essentially been a kind of proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. It's
mm,
much more complex than that. But if you had to simplify elements of it, you could say that it is a proxy war. I mean, Russia has, backed the Syrian government,
mm,
and the U.S. has staunchly backed the opposition, and they've been fighting each
mm,
other.
mm,
And the potential for that to escalate even further is very real, and that is incredibly dangerous.
mm,
I
mm,
don't think the U.S. is going to send. There's no way they're going to send troops into Russia, just because the potential of that escalating to nuclear war is
mm,
is debilitating. I mean, so that is actually a kind of glimmer of hope, but
mm,
there still is very real possibility that in other parts of the world, like in Ukraine, uh,
mm,
that the proxy war between NATO/the US and Russia can continue to grow. I mean,
yeah.
in Ukraine, the US is essentially already fighting a proxy war with Russia. I mentioned
Mm,
earlier that
mm,
in 2014, the US backed a coup in Ukraine that ousted the previous formerly democratically elected leader, Yanukovych, who
mm,
he was corrupt, he whatever. I mean, you can criticize a lot of things about him, but he was also the democratically elected leader, and he was pro-Russian, and
mm,
his Ukrainian government worked with Russia. Well, after the U.S. backed coup in 2014 and the Euromaidan protests, as I mentioned, you now have a pro-Western, pro-NATO government in Ukraine that's currently being led by a billionaire, Poroshenko, and that has
mm,
strong influences from neo-Nazis in the administration.
mm,
The Ukrainian government has recently, in Kiev, the capital, renamed a major road after a former Nazi collaborator. They, recently had a festival honoring a Ukrainian fascist who was a Nazi collaborator. Stepan Bandera, the former Nazi collaborator and famous Ukrainian fascist, is frequently honored by the Ukrainian government.
mm,
And in the eastern part of the country, Russian separatists have been fighting a war with the Ukrainian government. So
mm,
the U.S. is supporting the Ukrainian government, and Russia is supporting the separatists. This is a proxy war that could escalate.
mm,
And who knows where else that could escalate. So that's a very
mm,
real possibility. NATO already has thousands of troops on Russia's border. Um, I
mm,
mean, we
mm.
should do anything we can to prevent a hot war from breaking out.
Yeah.
As for China, I think that's even less possible or less
Mm,
likely, fortunately.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
China is different from Russia.
mm,
China is much more subtle in what it does. Russia actually kind of likes the bluster. Putin likes puffing up his chest and portraying himself as more powerful than he is. Um, I mean, Russia, their economy is actually the size of Italy's. They're not that economically powerful of a country. And in terms of global influence, I mean, the U.S. has 96% of the world's foreign military bases. The U.S. has
mm,
800
mm,
foreign military bases. The U.S.
mm,
has
mm,
150,000 military personnel in more than 150
mm,
countries. Russia is
mm,
nothing even remotely close to that. I mean,
mm,
of course,
mm,
the U.S. empire has been declining since the illegal invasion of Iraq, which was a complete
mm,
disaster, totally criminal. Russia likes to exaggerate its influence, and that, of course, has served it. It is actually um, that's partially why people are so obsessed in the U.S. with Russia, even though again
mm,
it's actually not. It's not a threat at all. It's not that
Yeah.
powerful of a country. China is very different. China does the opposite. China minimizes and downplays how powerful it is, which is
Mm.
actually a very clever strategy.
Mm. Mm.
China, in terms of purchasing power, it's probably, I mean, the details of the actual economic size of the Chinese economy are not entirely clear, but China is probably the second largest economy. It might even be the largest economy at this point.
Mm.
The way
Mm.
the Chinese economy is tied up with the U.S. economy, it's hard to divorce which is part of which. But China
Mm.
is, I'm of the view that some scholars have articulated in recent years that China is the new global superpower of the future. The
Yeah.
U.S. is on the decline and China's on the rise.
Yes,
Now,
they're moving. They're actually trying to move away, sort of, in some ways, almost do a little bit of isolation of the US, aren't they? China and Russia and even some parts of Latin America. They sort of seem to be all kind of coalescing together
well, there have been
in a
attempts.
way, a little bit.
There was an attempt to create a banking system called the BRICS
Mm,
Bank. So
bricks, yeah.
Brazil, it's an acronym, BRICS,
Mm,
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Of
mm,
course, it's no longer going to happen because Brazil had a soft coup. Um, but
mm,
the fact in India, their role is also unclear. They have a
yes.
right-wing government that's pro-U.S. Modi, but
Mm,
that also is,
yeah.
taking some different paths. I mean, I think the future is China and India, the
Right.
two largest countries. India is growing a lot too, but especially China.
And
And
they're having a bit of a thing with one another at the moment. Like there's actually some tensions up near the border and stuff. I don't know why that suddenly happened. If there's some foul play happening somewhere, do you know, it's just suddenly
yeah,
flared up.
well, and they've had on and off relations in the past few years in particular. I
Mm.
mean, we don't really have too much time to go into that. I mean,
Yeah, sure.
that gets into Cold War history. But what is very clear is that
Mm,
China is an ascendant power, and especially
mm,
economically. And
mm,
and I'm not necessarily saying that. I mean, I will flatly say that I think
mm,
a China-led global order would be in some ways better than a U.S. global order. There's no question.
mm,
However, that
mm.
doesn't mean it's going to be
No,
ideal. There are still
no.
problems to deal with, of course.
Yes.
But China's foreign policy is different. China,
Mm,
how many countries has China invaded? The
yes.
U.S. military is a very different institution. The U.S. military is so enormous. In fact,
Yeah.
the Russian military spending per year
Yes.
is
So,
1/10 of
mm,
U.S. I mean, it's just, in fact, the U.S. just expanded defense spending, and the
yes.
expansion of U.S. defense spending by more than $50 billion per year is
Yeah.
more than all of Russia's budget. So
Yeah.
it's so unfair to compare those two. China is
Mm,
very different. China has the largest country in the world, 1.3 billion people. Um, I really do think that we're seeing a global shift. It's happening slowly, but uh, it's hard to speculate too much. And of course, the U.S. is desperate. The U.S. empire is on the decline. They're trying to do what they can to prevent the rising power of China.
yeah.
I don't think that's going to lead to a physical war, but it could lead to proxy wars, and it could also lead to a trade war. Before Trump entered office, there was a lot of discussion of a potential trade war between the U.S. and China. It looks like Trump might back off that, and he's actually backed off on a lot of the anti-China rhetoric. But I mean, I
Mm.
don't know if you've ever seen like any of these videos of Trump saying China. He's just like China, China, China.
No, I
Like
know. I
he said
know.
it, he said
China.
it, he said it more than basically any other issue. He said China and
Really?
ISIS. Um,
Yes.
but even though he's backed off on that, I think what it demonstrates is that it's very clear in the kind of like cognitive dissonance of the U.S. empire that
Mm,
everyone knows what's actually happening, and they're not really speaking about it as much. But that's the reason for the Pacific tilt under the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton, in particular, was really talking a lot about this notion of the Pacific tilt, of the tilt toward the Pacific, of the
mm,
transition of kind of militaristic energy and focus, moving it toward East Asia. And I think we're going to
right.
see more of that. Japan is also rising too, and of course, Japan and China historically, have had very negative tensions. And Japan is a far-right government, which is currently led by Shinzo Abe, who is linked to this fascist group that wants to restore the Japanese emperor. So the potential for this to spiral out of control is very real. I don't think we'll see a direct U.S. war on China, but who knows what can happen with Japan? Who knows what can happen in the future with the Korean Peninsula? We should be very concerned, and we shouldn't. Well, we should focus on the wars in the Middle East and focus on what's happening in Latin America. We should also not forget that what's not being spoken about, the kind of behind the scenes activities going on in East Asia, are going to determine the future.
Yeah, because I know that they don't, the US doesn't really want the South and the North of Korea to sort of unite, because that would be, they just don't want that to happen. And then if that happened, I think there was some talk that Japan would start to kind of become a nuclear kind of a power itself, and then and they'd kind of be moving away from, like, the US would kind of completely lose control of that situation. So they don't want the South and North to get together. And sometime, I don't know, maybe I don't know if you're able to come back in a few months and talk about AFRICOM. I'd really be interested to talk about AFRICOM, because that's a complete wow, that's a real sort of whole other story, and I'm not sure what's going on there. I can see there's bases everywhere now in Africa, but that's something that would be very interesting to talk about. I don't know if you, I hope that you'll be able to come back sometime in the future to talk again. That would be great.
Someone just commented,
yes.
The Asia pivot. I mean, that's the language the administration was using. Also, like the Pacific tilt, the Asia pivot. That is where a lot of attention is going to be in the future, and it's important to. I mean, it's not new, of course. The U.S. waged borderline genocidal wars in Southeast Asia, in Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, killing millions of people. And the U.S. military has been focusing on the Middle East, but there's a very real potential for that to move back into Asia. On the point of AFRICOM, really quickly, I'll just mention that this has gotten so little attention, but it's one of the most significant developments in the past decade. The Obama administration, again, as I mentioned earlier, Obama was very intelligent in the way he managed U.S. empire. There's no question, he was still an imperialist. He still was pro-war, but he wasn't Bush. He outsourced his wars. He was more covert in it, and he also mastered the use of covert operations and special forces. Instead of sending 10,000 troops, he would send special operations forces who would go secretly on the ground in the country. And in Africa in particular, in the continent, that is the site of the expansion of U.S. special operations forces more than any other part of the world. The Intercept has done some really good reporting on this. But if you look at the explosion of the presence of U.S. special operations forces in Africa, there are a majority of African countries currently have U.S. special operations forces in them, and AFRICOM is leading a lot of this. So while we're seeing some changes in foreign policy, the pivot to Asia, we're also seeing the expansion of dirty wars, of covert wars being waged at a lower level, kind of shadowy in the background inside Africa. And a lot of this is related to Western corporations. Africa is an enormous continent, the largest continent, and has enormous natural resource reserves. And there are a lot of small level wars being waged in the country over these natural resources. So when we're looking at Western companies that are extracting these, this is part and parcel of the growing AFRICOM presence.
And speaking of outsourcing, I heard that Eric Prince is trying to get a privatized army. I forget what the name of that. It used to be Blackwater, but now it's something else. Yeah, and now he wants to do that in Afghanistan. That's what a horror story that would be. I mean, as if there aren't enough war crimes going on in these various countries without having and a completely unaccountable sort of private army. I mean, and I could see that happening. I could see
Yeah,
that happening.
and for those who don't know, Eric Prince is the former head of Blackwater, which is a mercenary firm notorious for a 2007 massacre of 17 Iraqi civilians. In fact, just last week or 2 weeks ago, one of the Blackwater employees, the contractors who was involved in the massacre of Iraqi civilians, he was recently pardoned. Had been charged with first-degree murder, and he was pardoned. So talk about impunity.
Oh yeah.
And now the Trump administration is allegedly considering outsourcing the war in Afghanistan and privatizing it. To be clear, the U.S. has already privatized large parts of it. And there's actually an Australian reporter who's one of the best, Anthony Lowenstein, who has done a lot of good reporting. He has a really good book published by Verso. I have it around here somewhere, called Disaster Capitalism. And I think, no, it's not weird. And Disaster Capitalism has several chapters, and Anthony reported from different parts of the world, but he actually visited Afghanistan, and Anthony interviewed a bunch of private military contractors. There's something called the PMC, private military companies inside Afghanistan, which already carry out many services in the country. They did in the Iraq War as well. And Anthony interviewed a PMC employee who said very explicitly that he's in Afghanistan to make money. And he said basically that wherever there's a war, we will go to make money. So this isn't new, but according to Eric Prince, who is also an extreme Christian fundamentalist, like he's like I joke he's a Christian Wahhabi. Wahhabism is like a ideology. He's very and he's also related significantly. It's important to point out he's related to
Betsy
DeVos, who's the extremely rich billionaire education secretary here in the U.S. Well, according to Prince, he says that that the Trump administration is going to privatize the war in Afghanistan. We'll see if it's true, but it's a very bad sign, and it's reflective of the decline in U.S. power, but it's also a reflection of how capitalism continues to cannibalize itself, how governments are outsourcing not just their schools, they're not just privatizing water systems, utilities, they're now privatizing their own military. And and this is suicidal. It's simply suicidal. And not only is it going to be horrible for Afghan civilians, who of course suffer the most, and Afghan civilians keep hundreds dying a month, but it's also, at the end of the day, completely cannibalistic. Yeah,
and I mean, I wonder, how the opium has increased incredibly, the poppy crops, etc. And I wonder if that's also being funneled through the CIA, keeps them going. You know how they keep, using drugs in various decades to fund their special ops and stuff. But I mean, opium's never been as big. It's just skyrocketed in Afghanistan.
So that's there's a big opioid epidemic in the U.S. and part of the subtext that's not mentioned is the war in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is the world's largest producer of opium. How those are related, it's not clear yet, but they are related in some ways. And I'll just add some historical context. Jeremy Scahill, the Intercept reporter, a great journalist here in the U.S., he recently interviewed a journalist for his podcast Intercepted. And the journalist was an expert on the U.S. campaign in Southeast Asia. And in his interview, this journalist with Jeremy Scahill, he spoke about how the CIA had used opium in particular, spread around heroin, to raise money in Vietnam. And especially in the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese regime. So, I mean, we still need much more reporting. We need more investigation of what's been happening. But we should absolutely consider the history of the CIA and intelligence agencies laundering drugs and facilitating, even if they're not directly doing it, indirectly facilitating or turning a blind eye to drug trafficking. You know,
Yeah.
the Contras are another famous example in
Mm,
Nicaragua. You know, these
mm,
far-right death squads who would massacre civilians and were largely bankrolled by drug money.
mm,
Also, of course, many other right-wing paramilitary groups throughout Latin America. We now know that the CIA was working with them and using
yeah.
drug money to fund a lot of it.
Yeah.
So we should be, and also, I mean, again, this is another one of those big topics, but another
Mm,
part of the opioid epidemic in the U.S. that's not discussed is
yes.
pharmaceutical companies who are
Yes.
flooding poor areas of the country like Appalachia, especially West Virginia, with
Yeah.
millions of bottles
Oxycodone.
of,
Mm,
yeah, oxycodone and all of
yeah.
these painkillers. And then
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
become addicted to these cheap painkillers.
Yes.
I read some really good reporting that said that there was something like 400 pain pills for every person in West Virginia.
Yeah. Yeah, there's
It's
this one small state too where they actually had a huge amount of oxycodone going through it. I can't remember the name of but it was just, yeah, and there's heaps and heaps of overdoses now. And there's this particular opioid which is, oh, huge, many times more powerful than fentanyl. And it's actually knocking people off. I forget what it's called, but it's just basically it could kill like it's so powerful. Just a small amount could kill thousands of people. But I mean, I wonder if this pumping these, apart from big pharma just making lots of money from people's addictions, but really a way in some ways of knocking off the population. Do you know what I mean? Reducing population by just flooding. I mean, that's speculation, but sometimes I wonder about that. Destroying
yeah,
communities
I
with
don't think it's as much of that. I mean, a lot of these communities that are being targeted, it's poor communities in the South, Appalachia, and other
Mm,
parts of the country. I mean,
yeah,
these are not, these communities are already suffering enough. They don't have much
yeah,
economic power.
yeah,
I mean, I don't think it's simply about profit.
yeah,
Corporations, at the end of the day is they want to sell pills. They want to sell more and more pills. They don't care who's buying them. They don't care if they're addicted. They don't care what the consequences are. That's the logic of the system.
yeah,
And the thing is, it's not just that there are some evil Mr. Burns like hand twirling
yeah,
corporate
yeah,
villains.
right.
It's actually even
Mm,
it's like I said earlier, it's simpler but more insidious. The
yeah,
reality is that there's a capitalist system and a
mm,
corporation that refuses to sell pills and flood this region with pills will be replaced by another one. If they don't do it,
yeah.
their competitor will do it. That's how
You
capitalism
know,
works.
yeah, and I also think too, though, there's people who are there's so many people suffering now in the US. Like, I mean, so many people are just struggling. They're working three jobs, and the austerity is just it's just awful. And it's no wonder people end up desperate and just sort
Mhm.
of get into. I mean, there's 40,000, I think, people suiciding every year in the United States. I mean, it's that's a tragedy, and that life has been made so untenable for so many people. That is where that's where the roots of revolution and rebellion happen. Where people are between a rock and a hard place, and it can only people start to push back. So, but I just think that's incredibly sad.
Yeah, and tying
When you
together
read,
these issues briefly, a
mm,
lot of suicides are very frequent among soldiers, among people
right,
who
yes,
have horrible PTSD and they can't get treatment. And
mm,
suicide rates they're incredible among
mm,
veterans. So it really
mm,
ties together the issues we've been talking. We've been talking about war, the effects here
mm,
at home. These
yeah,
things. I mean, again, we should always center the victims who in the region whose lives
yes,
are destroyed, whose families are destroyed.
mm,
I mean, the real victims of these wars are Iraqis, Palestinians, etc.
yes, yeah,
However, we also should consider the real costs here at home to veterans, to our tax dollars, the fact that
mm,
we can't have universal health care, we can't have funding
mm,
for schools, we can't have any of these
mm,
good social services because we have to
mm,
fund more and more and more war.
mm. Yeah, yeah. I've been sort of interested in modern monetary theory via real progressives, and that's a very interesting thing that one day I'll probably interview Steve or somebody about it. But that's another story. That's about the economy, but and funding and spending, etc. But yeah. But anyway, it's a really the whole austerity thing has to go the other way, because and the last thing I wanted to say too about the Pentagon is they did a study recently, and they have noted that the US empire, but they didn't call it that, but it's actually on the decline.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why it's, in some ways it feels like it's thrashing about, threatening people. It's like a sort of a wounded something thrashing about and threatening everybody. It can, I think, the military and everything, they can see they're losing grip of lots of situations, and it's sort of like, that's what it feels like to me. They're just losing a grip and
no, you're absolutely right.
About, yeah.
And someone commented, austerity is counterproductive, creates more poverty. Absolutely true. I mean, what's incredible is the leading institutions internationally that impose austerity, namely the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, have published research acknowledging this. Ironically, the IMF published a report last year titled "Neoliberalism Oversold," and in the article, which was written by economists at the International Monetary Fund, they acknowledge that the neoliberal policies they've been imposing on the planet are actually counterproductive. They don't do what they say they're supposed to do, and they actually hurt economies. But that was just someone's comment. On this point, it's important to understand, however, that empires are the most dangerous in this stage.
Yes.
When empires are in when the end of the Roman Empire, and I mean, we'll see what happens, but it's really important. One of the most important things right now, I think people on the left can do, especially in the US, but not just in the US, in Australia, in Europe, in Western countries, is to really revive the anti-war movement. And we see this with Jeremy Corbyn.
Absolutely.
Jeremy Corbyn is an incredible politician, not only because, he's a lifelong socialist, not only because, he has proposed a lot of great policies, but also because he shares those things with Bernie Sanders. However, Corbyn is better than Bernie Sanders in some important ways, because Corbyn has always understood that anti-war politics has to be at the center of what he does. Bernie Sanders has always been weak on foreign policy and wars.
Yes.
Corbyn was one of the leading activists against apartheid in South Africa. In fact, Corbyn was arrested at anti-apartheid protests. There's a famous photo of him. So he really understands this stuff. So it's been great to see in the UK how there's been a resurging anti-war movement led by Corbyn and many of the people in the Stop the War coalition. What we really need that in the US and Australia and elsewhere, because as we're entering this new century, we've already seen so many wars, and unfortunately we have to consider the real possibility of a World War III happening in the near future. I mean,
really?
To be frank,
because that would be the end, wouldn't it? Though,
well,
then if it's because it'd be nuclear.
I mean, I don't think
because Russia doesn't want to have any. Russia doesn't want to do any ground troops. They said they're not going to do the ground troop thing again because that's a disaster for them. So I don't think they're going to go that way. Do you know?
Well, we shouldn't. I mean, Chomsky has been talking about this for years, and he's Chomsky. Like, we should listen to him.
Yeah.
Chomsky has repeatedly warned that the world right now faces two astronomical problems. One, climate change. And we didn't even talk about climate change today. That's a whole but that is an existential problem. But also nuclear war. And Chomsky, this is one of the
it's one or the other, really. I wonder which one's going to get us first. I know that climate change definitely is going to get us.
Well, I mean, Chomsky certainly knows much more than I do. So it concerns me that he's worried about that. But I'll say that I don't think nuclear war is on the horizon. It's just too catastrophic. Like things are bad, but corporations are fine with war. Corporations don't want nuclear war. They actually don't, because that just means that everything they have will be destroyed. So, I mean,
you don't think they're completely delusional and think that they can survive it in their bunkers, and you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, I don't think we'll be pushed to that point, but I think we should be prepared for especially more proxy wars. And that's why it's just so important to revive the anti-war movement, because
isn't it?
yeah, because since the Iraq War, especially in the U.S. under the Obama administration, under a Democratic two-term administration, a lot of people just started forgetting about what's going on outside of U.S. borders, and we really need to revive that because when Trump wages a new war, who knows where it will be? Maybe Korean Peninsula, maybe Venezuela, who knows? We really need people who are going to speak out because this is intolerable, and
Yeah, it really
until that changes, that we're talking about changing domestic politics. They're so closely related. Like if we could have stopped the Iraq War, imagine the political change we could have engaged in internally inside the U.S. Like these are closely related issues, and the stronger the anti-war movement is, the stronger the left is domestically, and the more influence we have over creating important progressive policies we need.
Yeah, there's just a whole there's a whole platter of imperialists though that people seem to keep voting in again and again and again. They're all imperialists. You know, Sanders is an imperialist. He's been an imperialist for a long time. I don't know. Anyway, it's yeah, it's all very interesting. You never know. President Zuckerberg, wouldn't that be marvelous? Anyway, Ben, so thank you so much for it's been very kind of you. I know you've got to go on a trip this afternoon, and we've been about 2.5 hours, so that's really great. And you've covered so much, and you know so much, so that's really great. So thank you so much for accepting my invitation. And Nick, I'll just quickly tell people that next week David Swanson is going to be talking about some issues. He's a journalist and an activist, and he's written some books, and he's very much into anti-war, which is great. And that's one of the points of this whole program is, is to present anti-imperialist, anti-war positions and sometimes veganism, and they're all related actually. So anyway, but thank you so much, Ben, for joining us, and I really appreciate it. And I'll say goodbye to everybody, and join me next week, Friday, 9:15 Eastern Daylight Savings Time PM. And yeah, so thanks a lot, Ben.
Thank you. So, and I also want to thank the great messages that people are commenting. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'm glad you all enjoyed it.
I put your website up, Ben, so people can check out Moderate Rebels, which is the new podcast that Ben is. It's a great name, and they've got a good sense of humor. I love the avatar, so if you can check that out, Moderate Rebels, and just check out Ben's website, bennorton.com. I popped that up a few times on the screen. Okay, well, thanks so much, Ben.
Thank you.
Hopefully
it was a great
we'll be able to have you again. Pardon?
It was a great discussion. I'm glad we covered so many issues.
Oh, yes, it's great. Okay, well, thanks a lot. Bye, everybody. Bye for now. Bye, Ben.
Talk to you soon.
Yeah, bye.